Imagine walking through a library of ancient maps, and every single one, from Russia to China, marks a massive empire labeled Tartary. Now imagine that empire covers half of Asia, has its own architecture, currency, and even military uniforms. And then by the 19th century, it's just gone. Not conquered, not absorbed, gone. The maps were literally republished without it. Why? Who wanted Tartary forgotten, and what secrets are buried in its ruins? That's the enigma of Tartary. And in this video, we're pulling back the curtain on the empire the textbooks erased. But before we dive in, if you're new to this channel, consider hitting that like and subscribe button if you haven't already. Also, let us know where you're watching from and what time it is. So without further ado, let's begin. History is a landscape we walk through, but not all of it is solid ground beneath our feet. Some regions of the past shift like sand dunes, and some lie buried so deep that we forget they ever existed at all. This is a story about one such place, a name that once covered a vast expanse of the known world and now lingers only in the margins of old books and the corners of old maps. To understand what happened, we must first learn to see the map of the world as it was drawn in the minds of people who lived long before us. For 1,000 years, from the Middle Ages to the dawn of the modern era, there was a name that appeared on every chart, in every atlas, and in every chronicle of travel and exploration. That name was Tartary. It was a vast region, so wide and so deep that it seemed to cover everything east of the known world and north of the civilized empires. On the maps of the 16th and 17th centuries, Tartary sprawled across the entire expanse of northern and central Asia. From the borders of Muscovy to the shores of the Pacific, from the Arctic wastes to the high plateaus of Tibet. It was a land of rivers and steppes, of deserts and forests, of frozen tundra and towering mountain ranges. It was, by any measure, a giant among the regions of the earth, and yet today you will not find it. Open any modern atlas and run your finger across the same territory. The land is still there, of course. The mountains have not crumbled, and the rivers still flow. But the names have changed. What was once Tartary is now divided among Russia, China, Kazakhstan, Mongolia, and a dozen other states. The old name has vanished from official maps, from school textbooks, and from the common vocabulary of geography. It is as if a great country, larger than any nation alive today, simply slipped out of existence, leaving behind only a memory and a question. How does a place this large disappear? That is the mystery we will explore. It is not a simple question, and the answers are not simple either. Some of them are rooted in the slow, patient work of cartographers and scholars, others in the politics of empires and the ambitions of kings. So let us begin with the sheer scale of the thing. When European mapmakers of the Renaissance sat down to draw the world, they faced a problem. Their knowledge of the earth was partial, stitched together from ancient texts, travelers' tales, and the occasional bold expedition. But a map cannot leave a blank space forever. The unknown yearned to be filled, and so the map makers filled it with names. Tartary was one of those names, but it was more than a label for ignorance. It was a place that real people had visited and written about, a place with a history and a people of its own. The problem was that the history was thin, and the people were many, and the map makers had to choose how to represent them all with the tools they had. So they drew a great block of land, sometimes colored pink or yellow or green, and they labeled it Tartary. They subdivided it into regions, each with its own name and its own supposed boundaries. There was Russian Tartary, which stretched from the Urals to the Pacific. There was Chinese Tartary, which lay beyond the Great Wall and included the vast lands of Mongolia and the deserts of the Gobi. And there was independent Tartary, a mysterious middle ground that seemed to belong to no one and everyone at once, the homeland of the nomadic horsemen who had once terrified the settled world. These names appeared on map after map, generation after generation, until they became as familiar to readers as the names of the continents themselves. The Tartary of the maps was a strange blend of fact and fiction, of measured distances and imagined frontiers. The people who lived there were a collection of tribes and clans, of herders and hunters, of farmers and traders, speaking 100 different languages and following 100 different customs. To the European eye, however, they all looked alike. They were the Tartars, a name that conjured images of horsemen sweeping across the plains, of tents and yurts, of fierce warriors and strange customs. The name itself was a kind of shorthand, a way of saying the other, without having to look too closely at the details. The story of the name of the Tatars and the Mongols and the confusion that followed belongs to a later chapter of this journey. For now, we must stay with the phantom itself, with the great blank space on the map that was Tartary, and with the mystery of its disappearance. Because the first thing we need to understand is that the disappearance was not sudden. There was no single moment when Tartary ceased to exist, no dramatic event that struck it from the records of the world. Instead, the name faded slowly, like a photograph left in the sun, until one day people looked at the maps and realized that the old familiar label was no longer there. The process began in the 18th century, when the great powers of Europe and Asia began to fill in the blank spaces with real borders and real names. The Russian Empire, pushing eastward across Siberia, brought its own administrative divisions and its own way of naming the land. The Chinese Empire, extending its reach into the Western territories, did the same. The old mapmaker's Tartary, a convenient fiction for an age of uncertainty, had no place in this new world of precise frontiers and national sovereignty. It was not that the land itself had changed. The land was the same as it had always been. But the way people saw it and the way they organized it in their minds was changing beyond recognition. By the 19th century, the term was already a relic, a curiosity from the age of exploration that had no place in the age of empire. Cartographers stopped using it, or used it only with a note of apology, as if it were an old friend whose stories had grown tiresome. Schoolchildren learned the new names instead. The great rivers and mountain ranges got their modern titles. The cities and provinces took on their current forms. And Tartary, the phantom empire, slipped away into the footnotes of history. A footnote to a footnote, a name that once meant everything and now meant nothing at all. But did it really disappear? That is the question at the heart of this journey, and we will return to it again and again. There are those who believe that the erasure was not innocent, that Tartary was deliberately removed from the record by the powers that conquered it, that the truth of its existence lies buried beneath a conspiracy of silence. These are stories we will examine in their turn. Roots of the name. That map lingers, a phantom in the mind. The wide, pale space marked Tartary, a ghost of a name. We must ask a simple question. Where did that word come from? How did it find its way onto parchment and into the imagination of an entire continent? The answer begins not with a single stroke, but with a slow drift of names through centuries of speech. The trail starts far to the east on the steppes of Mongolia. It begins with a people known as the Tatar. Their name, Tatar, was a name that carried a weight of fear and awe. To their neighbors, they were a force of nature, a storm on horseback. They were a confederation of Turkic tribes, fierce and skilled in the ways of war. Their world was the endless grass, the open sky, and the hard rhythm of the horse. They had no cities of stone, but their camps were vast. For centuries, the Tatars lived in this world of movement. They were a part of the great nomad cycle, raiding and trading, forging alliances and breaking them. Their name was known to the settled peoples around them. The Chinese knew them. The Persians knew them. The name was a fact of the Eastern world, a marker on the edge of the known. And here is where the confusion begins. The people of Europe, hearing of the terror from the East, did not stop to sort out the tribal distinctions of the steppe. To them, the horsemen were a single monstrous horde. They heard the name Tatar, but they also heard the name Mongol. The two were used together, mixed and blended. The distinctions of the steppe were lost in the roar of the charge. A powerful force shaped this conflation. It was the power of language and the power of a very dark pun. The Latin word for the underworld, for the realm of the dead, was Tartarus. It was a place of punishment, a deep and fiery pit. To the medieval mind, it was an absolute evil. When the horsemen from the east came, they seemed to be the very agents of this place. They were a scourge sent from hell. The similarity between Tatar and Tartarus was too tempting to ignore. Scholars and chroniclers of the time made the connection explicit. They wrote of the Tartari, the people of Tartarus. The name was a weapon, a way of understanding the incomprehensible. It turned a real flesh and blood army into a mythic force of damnation. The simple historical name of the Tatar was painted over with the color of hellfire. The word Tartary was thus born. It was not a name the people of the steppe used for themselves. It was a label given by the terrified and the distant. It was a name of fear. This new name, Tartary, was not just a name for the people, it was a name for the land. Where did these people come from? The answer was as vast and as vague as the fear itself. They came from the endless east. They came from beyond the edge of the maps. And so, Tartary became the name for that entire terrifying unknown. It was a geographic term, but it was a geography of the imagination. It was a land that existed in the space between knowledge and dread. The conflation was complete. The Tars were a real people. The Mongols were a real people. But Tartary was a European idea. It was a container for everything that was east, vast, and frightening. The name stuck to the land like a shadow. It was written on the maps of the medieval world, a place of utter otherness. It was the source of the horsemen who had brought the world to its knees. It was the home of the Antichrist for some, a place of strange and monstrous races for others. The name carried with it all the weight of the invasion. The specific events of Genghis Khan's life, his rise, his campaigns, his empire, are a story for another moment. What matters here is the seed that was planted. The name Tartary was not born from careful observation. It was born from a terrified mishearing, a linguistic accident, and a dark pun. The Tatars were real. The Mongols were real. But the thing that was created in the minds of Europe, the thing they called Tartary, was a ghost. It was a label for a fear, a vast and empty space on the map of the mind, waiting for a story to fill it. The name grew. It did not stay confined to the plains of Mongolia. As the Mongol Empire expanded, so did the idea of Tartary. The horsemen pushed into Russia, into Persia, into the heart of the Islamic world. Everywhere they went, the name went with them. It clung to the conquered lands. The Golden Horde, the western part of the Mongol Empire, ruled over the Russian principalities for centuries. Their rule was called the Tatar yoke by the Russians. The name Tatar, and by extension Tartary, became the word for their masters. It was a name of submission and resentment. For a medieval European, the world was a small place. It was centered on the Mediterranean, on Christendom. Beyond its borders lay the unknown. The East was a source of wonder and terror. It was the land of Prester John, a mythical Christian king. It was the land of the 10 lost tribes of Israel. It was the land of Gog and Magog, the apocalyptic enemies, and it was the land of Tartary. It was a land of extremes, of unimaginable wealth and unimaginable cruelty. The name Tartary became a key part of this imagined world. It was a necessary part of the geography of myth. The word itself, Tartary, has a sound to it. It is a heavy, guttural word. It feels ancient and hard. It does not roll off the tongue easily. It is a name that suggests stone and cold and endless distance. It is a name that fits the fear that created it. It is a name that would be used for centuries, a label for a land that was forever being redefined, yet always remaining the same. It was always the land of the other. It was always the vast, enigmatic East, the Mongol legacy. And so the name that began with a wandering people found its way into the mouths of kings and scholars. But the word alone would not have carried such weight. It took a man and his empire to give Tartary its fearsome meaning. That man was Temujin, born in the windswept steppes of what is now Mongolia. His rise was not gentle. He united warring tribes through blood and loyalty, through cunning and courage. In 1206, the Great Council of Chieftains declared him Genghis Khan, ruler of all who lived in felt tents. The name meant universal ruler, and he took it as a command. What followed was conquest on a scale the world had never seen. Genghis Khan turned his horsemen westward, and they rode with a speed that seemed impossible. Their bows were small but deadly, their horses tough and tireless. They could shoot while riding at full gallop. They could travel days without stopping for rest. Armies that stood against them melted away like snow in spring. The empire grew with astonishing speed. First came the Jin dynasty in northern China. Then the Khwarezmid Empire in Persia fell, its cities reduced to ash. The horsemen pushed into the Caucasus and across the Russian plains. By the time Genghis Khan died in 1227, his empire stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the Caspian Sea. It was the largest contiguous land empire in history, and it kept growing under his heirs. His grandson Batu carried the banners further west. The Golden Horde, as his branch came to be known, swept through the forests of Russia and into Eastern Europe. They took Kiev, burned its churches, and made its people pay tribute. They crossed the Carpathian Mountains and struck at Poland and Hungary. In 1241, at the Battle of Legnica, they crushed a combined army of Poles, Germans, and Teutonic Knights. The same year, they defeated the Hungarians at the Battle of Mohi. Europe trembled. Historians debate the reasons for the Mongol withdrawal from Europe. The succession crisis after the death of the great Khan Ogadai in faraway Karakorum is traditionally cited as the key factor, and the commanders did turn back for the struggle over leadership. But logistics and terrain also played their part. Whatever the cause, the invasion stalled, and the terror had already taken root in the European mind. The word Tartar became linked with Tartarus, the deepest, darkest pit of the underworld in Greek mythology. To medieval Christians, these riders seemed like demons released from hell. The West had heard rumors of the East long before. Marco Polo would later travel the Silk Road and marvel at the court of Kublai Khan, Genghis's grandson. But Polo's accounts, written in the late 1200s, mixed wonder with strangeness. He described cities paved with gold and lands of endless wealth. He also described customs that seemed utterly alien to European readers. The line between fact and fantasy blurred. This vagueness suited the European imagination. Tartary became a blank canvas onto which they could project their hopes and fears. Some wrote of a land of wonders, where silk and spices flowed like water, where palaces were made of porcelain and gold. Others wrote of a land of darkness, where cannibal tribes roamed and the sun never shone. Both images existed side by side, each feeding the other. The Mongols themselves added to the mystique. They were not one people, but many, bound together by conquest and shared rule. The empire encompassed Chinese scholars, Persian administrators, Turkic herders, and Siberian hunters. Its cities, like Karakorum and later Khanbalik, modern Beijing, were crossroads of the world. Goods and ideas moved along the Silk Road with unprecedented freedom. A traveler could journey from the Mongol-controlled frontiers near the Black Sea all the way to the Yellow Sea without leaving Mongol-administered territory, provided they had the right papers and a strong horse. But the empire did not hold together. It split into khanates, each ruled by a different branch of Genghis's family. The Golden Horde held the western steppes, the Ilkhanate ruled Persia and the Middle East, the Chagatai Khanate controlled Central Asia, the Yuan dynasty sat on the throne of China. They shared a common heritage, but not a common purpose. They fought among themselves, formed alliances, and broke them. The unity of the early conquests faded into memory. Even so, the name endured. The Khanates remained powerful for centuries. The Golden Horde exacted tribute from Russian princes until the late 1400s. The Crimean Khanate, its successor, survived into the 1700s and raided deep into Eastern Europe. The people of these lands were still called Tartars, and their territories still appeared on maps as Tartary. The word had outlived the empire that gave it birth. For the West, the legacy of Genghis Khan was complex. On one hand, he was a monster, a destroyer of cities, a bringer of death. Chronicles from Persia and Russia, written by his victims, painted him in the darkest colors. On the other hand, he was a figure of awe, a ruler whose power dwarfed any king in Europe. Some writers even cast him as a righteous scourge, a whip of God sent to punish a sinful world. This double image persisted for centuries. The Mongols also changed the world in ways the West did not fully grasp. They reopened the Silk Road, connecting East and West more tightly than ever before. Ideas traveled along with goods. Gunpowder, papermaking, and the compass moved westward. European scholars gained access to knowledge preserved in the Islamic world. The Mongol peace, the Pax Mongolica, made this exchange possible. Without it, the Renaissance might have come later or not at all. But the West preferred its own stories. The legend of Prester John, a mythical Christian king said to rule a vast realm beyond the Muslim lands, attached itself to the Mongols for a time. Some hoped that the Great Khan might be a secret ally against the forces of Islam. Others feared he was the Antichrist, leading the hosts of Gog and Magog. Both hopes and fears were misplaced, but they fed the imagination of an age that hungered for wonders. By the time the Mongol Empire had fully fragmented, the name Tartary had taken on a life of its own. It no longer referred to a specific political entity. It referred to a region, a vast and mysterious expanse that filled the eastern half of every map. Cartographers filled it with strange creatures, legendary cities, and unnamed mountains. The real knowledge of the Mongols, their customs, and their history faded into the background. What remained was a symbol. As the medieval world gave way to the early modern, the maps grew more detailed. The blank spaces shrank. But Tartary remained, stubbornly large, stubbornly vague. It was a place that seemed to resist definition, a land that existed more in the imagination than in any political reality. The Mongols had built an empire of flesh and bone, of horse hoofs and arrow storms. What the West built in its place was an empire of ink and parchment, a Tartary that never was, but would not disappear. In the courts of Europe, learned men debated the nature of this eastern realm. Some argued that the Tartars were descended from the lost tribes of Israel, scattered by God across the steppes. Others claimed they were the peoples described by ancient geographers, the Scythians and Sarmatians of old. Each theory said more about the theorists than about the Tartars themselves. The truth that they were simply the heirs of a great conquest was too plain to satisfy. The legacy of Genghis Khan, seen through this haze of legend, became something larger than life. He was no longer a man of flesh and blood, born in a specific year, buried in an unmarked grave. He became an archetype, the perfect conqueror, the terrible and magnificent Lord of the East. The real history, the campaigns and alliances, the laws and letters, the families and feuds, all of it dissolved into a single image of power. Mapping the unknown. The medieval mappamundi were not maps as we know them. They were not tools for navigation, not instruments of measurement. The world was a circle, with Jerusalem at its center, the Garden of Eden somewhere to the east, and the edges filled with wonders and warnings. These maps were called TO maps for the T-shaped waters that divided the three known continents and the O of the ocean that surrounded them all. In this world, the east was the top, the head of the map, and in the east there was a place. It had no clear border, no defined coast, no cities marked with any certainty. It was simply there, a vast expanse of parchment where the ink ran thin and the imagination ran wild. This was Tartary. The cartographers of the Middle Ages did not draw what they knew. They drew what they had heard, what they had read, what they had been told by travelers who had themselves only heard and read. And what they had heard about Tartary was enough to make the hand tremble. The name itself was a whisper of dread. In the early 13th century, the Latin chronicler Matthew Paris wrote of the Tartars as a people who seemed to come from nowhere, a scourge unleashed upon the world. He spelled their name Tartary, a subtle shift that linked them to Tartarus, the deepest pit of the Greek underworld, a place of darkness and imprisonment. It was a clever pun, a scholarly joke, but it stuck. The Tartars were not just a people, they were a force of hell itself. And so on the Mappae Mundi, Tari was placed at the edge of the known world, beyond the reach of Christendom, beyond the reach of reason. It was a land of extremes, a place where the familiar rules of nature seemed to bend and break. The maps showed it as a region of monstrous races, of dog-headed men, of cyclopes with a single eye, of people who shaded themselves from the sun with their own enormous feet. These were not inventions of the cartographers themselves. They were inherited from the classical geographers, from Pliny and Solinus, who had populated the unknown corners of the earth with such beings. But now, they were placed within the borders of Tartary. The maps were also filled with the wonders of the East. The kingdom of Prester John, a legendary Christian king who was said to rule a vast realm somewhere beyond the Muslim world, was often placed near Tartary. Some maps put him in Africa, others in Asia, but his presence was a constant source of hope and curiosity. If a Christian king could exist so far away, perhaps the faith was more universal than it seemed. Perhaps the world was not as lost as it appeared. And of course, there was the land of Gog and Magog. These were the biblical nations, locked away by Alexander the Great behind great mountains, waiting for the end of times when they would break free and ravage the earth. The Tartars were often identified with these apocalyptic hordes. It was a convenient fit. They had come from the east, they had conquered with terrifying speed, and they seemed to be unstoppable. The equation was easy to make. Tartars were Gog and Magog, and their arrival was a sign that the end was near. The Mappamundi were not concerned with accuracy, but meaning. Every place on the map had a purpose, a lesson, a warning. Tartary was the lesson of pride, perhaps, or the warning of divine wrath. It was the place where the world ran out, where the known became the unknown, and where the unknown became the monstrous. Consider the Hereford map, one of the largest and most detailed of the medieval Mappae Mundi, created around the year 1300. It is a magnificent object, a single sheet of vellum, over 1.5 meters wide, filled with hundreds of images and inscriptions. At its top, where the east is placed, there is a depiction of the Last Judgment, with Christ enthroned above the world. Below him, in the earthly realm, are the wonders and terrors of the east. There are the Amazons, the warrior women who lived without men. There are the Blemmies, a people with no heads, their faces on their chests. And there is Gog and Magog enclosed within their mountains, waiting for their release. Tartary is not labeled as such on the Hereford map. The term had not yet become standardized, but the region is there, a vast expanse of Asia filled with these figures, a place of otherness. It is the space where the mapmaker's knowledge runs out and where his imagination takes over. But there was also a sense of wonder, a sense of curiosity. The East was not only a place of fear, it was a place of marvels, the spices, the silks, the precious stones, the strange animals, the different customs. All of these were objects of fascination. Tartary, as the gateway to the East, was a land of possibility. It was where the ordinary rules of life did not apply. It was where a man could find fortune or death, knowledge or madness. The travelers' accounts, like those of Marco Polo, added to the picture, but they did not simplify it. Polo's descriptions of the court of Kublai Khan, of the city of Cambaluc, of the wealth and power of the Mongol Empire were so extraordinary that many readers did not believe them. They called his book Il Milione, a title that may refer to his supposed exaggerations, his millions of lies. The truth was too strange to be accepted. The reality of Tartary was already being shaped by myth, and the myth was stronger than any report could be. The maps of the later Middle Ages, like the Catalan Atlas of 1375, began to incorporate some of this new information. The Catalan Atlas was created for the King of Aragon, and it is a work of great beauty and detail. It is not a mappa mundi in the old style, it is a portolan chart, a map designed for navigation with compass roses and coastlines. But it also includes the interior of Asia, and there in the east is a figure seated on a throne, surrounded by courtiers and soldiers. The figure is labeled Great Khan, the ruler of the Tartars. The Catalan Atlas shows the Khan's realm as a place of order and wealth. There are cities with walls and towers, caravans crossing the deserts, merchants trading their goods. This is a Tartary that is less terrifying, more exotic. It is a place of opportunity, a land that a Christian king might ally with or seek to convert. The myth is shifting from a source of dread to a source of allure, but even in the Catalan Atlas, the old fears remain. The monsters are still there, further to the east at the very edge of the world. The mapmaker has moved them, pushed them beyond the reach of the Khan's power, but he has not eliminated them. The unknown is still populated with wonders and terrors. The world is still a place of mystery. The cartographers did not know what was there. They did not need to know. The space on the parchment was enough. It was a blank, and the blank was filled with all their fears and all their hopes. It was a mirror, reflecting what they carried within themselves. As the centuries passed, the maps would change. The blank spaces would be filled in, the monsters would retreat, the borders would be drawn with more precision. But the idea of Tartary, the idea of that vast, mysterious, terrifying land, would persist. It would survive the maps that gave it shape, and it would continue to haunt the imagination long after the cartographers had moved on to other names. Renaissance rediscovery. The old maps had shown a land of wonder and fear, a place where the known world dissolved into rumor. Those medieval charts served their purpose for a time, but the Renaissance demanded more. The world was growing larger, and the minds of Europe were growing with it. They wanted to see farther, know more, and understand the shape of things. The printing press changed everything. Books could be made faster than ever before. Maps could be copied and shared. A scholar in Florence could hold the same chart as a merchant in Antwerp. This new age of discovery brought old ideas into fresh light, and Tartary sat at the center of that light, vast and mysterious on every new page. Abraham Ortelius looked at the world with careful eyes. He was a map maker from Antwerp, a city of trade and learning. In 1570, he published something remarkable. His Theatrum Orbis Terrarum gathered all the known maps of the world into one volume. It was the first modern atlas, a collection that let people see the entire Earth without leaving their homes. Ortelius gave Tartary a place of honor in his work. He showed it as a massive territory stretching across the eastern reaches of Asia. The land was marked with names that sounded strange to Western ears. There were mountains and rivers and deserts, all drawn with care. But the edges of Tartary were soft, uncertain. No one knew exactly where it ended or what lay beyond. This was the way of Renaissance cartography. Mapmakers blended what they knew with what they imagined. They used the reports of travelers and the writings of ancient authors. They filled empty spaces with decorative figures and mythical creatures. The maps were beautiful, but they were not always true. Consider the sources available to Ortelius and his peers. Marco Polo had traveled to the court of Kublai Khan in the 13th century. His accounts spoke of great cities and vast plains, of people who lived in tents and moved with their herds. These stories were passed down, copied by hand, and eventually printed. They became the foundation for European ideas about Tartary. But Polo's journeys were not the only source. There were also the reports of missionaries who ventured east. Giovanni da Pian del Carpine traveled to the Mongol court in the 1240s. William of Rubruck followed a decade later. These men wrote letters and books describing what they saw. Their observations mixed with older traditions, with tales from antiquity about the Scythians and other nomadic peoples. The Renaissance mapmakers took all of this material and shaped it into something new. They created a Tartary that was both real and imagined. It was real because it occupied actual space on the globe. It was imagined because so much of what they drew came from guesswork and legend. Ortelius divided Tartary into regions, each with its own name. There was the land of the Mongols, the land of the Tartars, and other territories that bordered the unknown. He placed cities and rivers where he believed they should be. Some of these locations were accurate, many were not. The map itself was a work of art, with delicate lines and careful lettering, but it was also a work of speculation. The geography of Tartary presented a particular problem. The region was enormous, covering more than a third of Asia. It included the vast steppes, the mountain ranges of the interior, and the frozen reaches of the north. No European had seen most of this land. The mapmakers had to work with fragments of information, piecing together reports from different travelers who had seen different parts of the whole. This led to a curious effect. Tartary appeared on the maps as a land of contradictions. It was empty, yet full of wonders. It was barren, yet rich in resources. It was a place of great cities, yet also a place where people lived in felt tents. The mapmakers did not try to resolve these contradictions. They simply presented what they had, and the contradictions became part of the mystery. Yet even as they pursued accuracy, they could not escape the pull of the imagination. The maps of the Renaissance are filled with beautiful illustrations. There are ships on the seas and monsters in the deep. The edges of the known world are decorated with images of strange peoples and exotic animals. Tartary, being so vast and so little known, attracted many of these fanciful additions. Some maps showed Tartary as a land of giants. Others depicted it as the home of the legendary Prester John, a Christian king who supposedly ruled a powerful realm somewhere in the east. These stories had been circulating for centuries, and they found their way onto the maps. The cartographers did not necessarily believe these tales, but they included them nonetheless. The maps were meant to inform, but they were also meant to delight. Consider the work of Gerardus Mercator, another great cartographer of the age. He created a map of the world in 1569 using a projection that bears his name. This map showed Tartary as a massive landmass stretching from the Caspian Sea to the Pacific Ocean. Mercator was a careful scholar who sought to improve on the work of his predecessors, but even he could not fill in the details of Tartary with confidence. The sheer size of the region made it difficult to map. A single journey across the steppes could take months. The climate was harsh, and the people were often hostile to strangers. Few Europeans had the opportunity to travel through Tartary, and fewer still returned with detailed observations. The maps had to be built from incomplete data, and the mapmakers knew this. The Renaissance maps also reflected a changing political reality. The Ottoman Empire had expanded into southeastern Europe, and the European powers were looking for new routes to the riches of the East. Tartary occupied a central position in these calculations. It was the land between Europe and China, the territory that separated the known from the unknown. Some cartographers tried to make sense of Tartary's political divisions. They marked the territories of different khans and princes. They showed the great trade routes that crossed the region, connecting the markets of Europe with the markets of Asia. These routes were the arteries of commerce, carrying silk and spices and precious metals across the continent. The Silk Road passed through Tartary, and this gave the region a practical importance that went beyond its geographical size. The merchants who traveled these routes brought back more than goods. They brought back stories, and these stories shaped the maps. The cartographers listened to the merchants and incorporated their reports into their work. But the merchants themselves had limited knowledge. They traveled along well-established routes, stopping at familiar cities and trading posts. They rarely ventured into the interior, away from the main roads. Their knowledge was real, but it was also partial. The maps reflected this partiality. The Renaissance was a time of transition. The old certainties were giving way to new questions. The maps of Tartary stood at this crossroads. They were medieval in their imagination and modern in their method. They looked backward to the legends of the past and forward to the discoveries of the future. Ortelius and his contemporaries created images of Tartary that would last for centuries. Their maps were copied and republished, spreading across Europe. They shaped the way people thought about the region, establishing a visual language that would persist long after the maps themselves had been superseded. This was the Tartary that the Renaissance rediscovered. It was not a new land, exactly, for it had been known to the ancients. But it was seen in a new way, with new eyes and new tools. The map makers of the period transformed Tartary from a vague concept into a visual presence, a place that could be seen and studied and imagined. The land itself remained unchanged. The steppes continued to stretch across the horizon. The rivers continued to flow to distant seas. But the image of Tartary, the idea of Tartary, underwent a transformation. It became more defined, more present, more real. And yet, in another sense, it became more mysterious. The more the map makers drew, the more they revealed how much they did not know. This paradox would continue for generations. Each new map would refine the image, but the mystery would remain. Tartary was too large, too varied, too unknown to be captured on a single sheet of paper. The best the cartographers could do was to suggest its scale and hint at its secrets. And so the Renaissance passed, leaving behind its beautiful maps and its beautiful questions. The image of Tartary that those maps created would endure, shaping the expectations of explorers and the dreams of scholars. The land itself would be transformed by the forces of history, but the image would persist, a ghost on the page, a memory of wonder. The image would not last forever. The maps would become outdated, replaced by more accurate charts. But the idea of Tartary, the image that the Renaissance created, would persist. It would survive the changes of the coming centuries, adapting to new circumstances and new audiences. It would remain a part of the European imagination, a reminder of a time when the world was still full of mystery. And that was the gift of the Renaissance map makers. They showed their contemporaries a world that was larger and stranger than they had known. They opened the door to discovery, and they made the unknown seem inviting. Their maps were not perfect, but they were a beginning, and beginnings matter. Empires within empires. The old maps of the Renaissance were broad and vague. They showed a great blank space, a land of rumor. But the 18th century brought a new kind of cartography. The Age of Enlightenment demanded order. It demanded lines. The map makers of Paris, Amsterdam, and London looked at the vastness of Tartary and decided it was too much. It was too big to be one thing. So they split it. They divided the immense unknown into 3 parts, each with its own name, its own borders, its own character. They created a trinity of territories, And in doing so, they made Tartary a puzzle of labels, a land that was one and yet three. The first of these was independent Tartary. The name itself was a promise. It suggested freedom. It suggested a land that answered to no crown, no emperor, no distant king. On the maps, it occupied the heart of Central Asia. It stretched from the Caspian Sea in the west to the borders of the Chinese Empire in the east. It reached north towards Siberia and south toward the mountains of Persia and the plains of India. The cartographers drew it with a soft, pale color. They filled it with the names of cities that sounded like music: Bukhara, Samarkand, Khiva. These were old places, ancient stops on the Silk Road. They had seen caravans and conquests. They had seen the armies of Alexander and Genghis Khan. But to the mapmakers, they were simply points on a grid. Independent Tartary was not truly independent. It was a patchwork of khanates and tribal lands. There was the Khanate of Khiva, a green oasis in a sea of sand. There was the Emirate of Bukhara, a city of minarets and madrasas, a center of learning and trade. There was the Khanate of Kokand, a smaller power in the fertile valleys of the Fergana region. These states were ruled by local dynasties. They fought each other over water and pasture. They traded with their neighbors and raided their enemies. But they were not a single nation. They were a collection of pieces, and the mapmakers gave them a single label for convenience. The label was a fiction, but it was a useful fiction. It told the reader, "Here be a land that no great power controls." And for a time, that was mostly true. The second part was Chinese Tartary. This was the land of the East, the territory that fell under the shadow of the Dragon Throne. On the maps, it occupied the vast interior of Asia. It covered the lands north of the Great Wall and west of the Chinese heartland. It included Mongolia and the deserts of the Gobi. It stretched up toward the Altai Mountains and down toward the Tibetan Plateau. The cartographers drew it in a different shade. They marked it with the names of places that were barely known to Europeans: Kashgar, Yarkand, Turfan. These were the oases of the Tarim Basin, the ends of the Silk Road. They were stops for traders and pilgrims, places where languages mixed and religions met. Chinese Tartary was a different kind of territory. It was not independent. It was not free. The Qing dynasty of China had claimed it in the late 17th and early 18th centuries. The Manchu emperors had pushed their borders outward. They had conquered the Mongols and the Uyghurs. They had brought the steppe under their rule. The mapmakers knew this. They showed it in their lines and labels. They called it Chinese Tartary because it belonged to China. But it was not Chinese in the way that Beijing or Shanghai was Chinese. It was a frontier. It was a land of nomads and herders, of Buddhist monasteries and Muslim mosques. The Chinese administration was light. It collected taxes and kept the peace, but it did not settle the land. The people of Chinese Tartary lived as they had lived for centuries. They moved with the seasons. They followed their herds, they prayed in their own ways, and the mapmakers from their studios in Europe tried to capture this vast, strange place with a single name. The third part was Russian Tartary. This was the land of the north. It was the largest of the three, the most forbidding, the least known. On the maps, it covered the entire sweep of Siberia. It stretched from the Ural Mountains in the west to the Pacific Ocean in the east. It reached from the Arctic Ocean in the north to the borders of Chinese Tartary and independent Tartary in the south. The cartographers drew it in the pale colors of the frozen wastes. They filled it with the names of rivers and forts: the Ob, the Yenisei, the Lena, the Amur. They marked the small towns that the Russians had built along these waterways. They noted the fur trading posts and the garrison outposts. They wrote the word Siberia across its northern reaches, but they kept the larger title of Russian Tartary for the whole. Russian Tartary was a land of exile. The czars sent their prisoners there. They sent their criminals and their political enemies. They sent them to the cold, to the forests, to the endless plains. The people who lived there were a mix of natives and newcomers. There were the Yakuts, who herded reindeer and horses. There were the Buryats, who followed the teachings of the Buddha. There were the Evenks and the Chukchi and the many other peoples of the north. And there were the Russians themselves, the settlers and the soldiers, the traders and the priests. They built wooden churches and log cabins. They cleared small fields in the forest. They lived in a land that was hard and unforgiving, The Russian state had been expanding into this territory for over a century. It had begun in the time of Ivan the Terrible, when the Cossacks had crossed the Urals and conquered the Khanate of Sibir. It had continued under the Romanovs. The Russians had pushed eastward, step by step. They had built forts along the rivers. They had made alliances with some tribes and crushed others. They had reached the Pacific coast by the mid-17th century. They had come into contact with the Chinese Empire and had signed treaties to define their borders. By the 18th century, the Russian claim to the north was firm. The mapmakers acknowledged it. They drew the borders with care. They showed the line that separated Russian Tartary from Chinese Tartary, a line that ran through mountains and forests, a line that was more a matter of negotiation than of nature. The three Tartaries were not equal. They were not alike. Independent Tartary was a land of deserts and oases, of ancient cities and proud rulers. Chinese Tartary was a land of steppes and mountains, of nomads and monks. Russian Tartary was a land of forests and tundra, of exiles and pioneers. But they shared a name. They shared a heritage. They were all part of the legacy of the Mongols, the vast empire that had once covered all of Asia. The mapmakers did not think of this. They were practical men. They were concerned with trade routes and political boundaries. They were concerned with the size of kingdoms and the locations of cities. But the name they used carried a weight. Tartary was not just a place. It was an idea. It was the memory of the great Khans, the horsemen who had ridden from the steppes to the gates of Vienna. It was the fear of the unknown, the mystery of the East. And by dividing it into three, the mapmakers tried to tame that mystery. They tried to make it comprehensible. They tried to fit it into their grid of lines and labels. The 18th century maps were beautiful objects. They were works of art with their ornate borders and their delicate colors. They were also works of power. They showed the world as the Europeans saw it. They showed the world as the Europeans wanted it. They divided the land into manageable pieces. They named the pieces and defined their edges. They made the unknown known. But the maps were not accurate. They were based on reports and rumors, on the accounts of travelers and the guesses of scholars. The borders they drew were not real. No one stood on the steppe and looked at a line. No one knew exactly where Tartary ended and China began. The mapmakers did their best, but their best was a work of imagination. They created a picture of the world that was more orderly than the world itself. The people who lived in the three Tartaries did not think of themselves as Tartars. They were Uzbeks and Turkmens, Mongols and Uyghurs, Yakuts and Buryats. They had their own names for their lands and their own stories about their past. The label of Tartary was an outsider's label. It was a European invention, a way of understanding a region that was too vast and too varied to be easily understood. The mapmakers used it because they had no better word. They used it because it was traditional, because it was familiar, because it appeared on the old maps that they used as their sources. They did not mean to erase the identities of the people who lived there. They simply did not know those identities. They did not know the complexity of the region, the depth of its history, the richness of its cultures. They saw a blank space on their charts, and they filled it with a name. The three Tartaries appeared on maps for most of the 18th century. They were a feature of the cartographic landscape, as familiar as the oceans and the continents. They were taught in schools and discussed in salons. They were the subject of books and the objects of imperial ambition. The rulers of Europe looked at them and saw opportunities. The rulers of Russia looked at them and saw a frontier. The rulers of Britain looked at them and saw a threat. But for the mapmakers, they were simply facts. They were simply the way the world was divided. They were the result of centuries of exploration and encounter, of trade and war, of knowledge and ignorance. And they were about to change. The age of the three Tartaries was coming to an end. The maps would soon be redrawn. But that is a story for another time. The great game begins. Those maps with their careful subdivisions, independent Tartary stretching from the Caspian toward the mountains, Chinese Tartary lying beyond the Great Wall, Russian Tartary covering the vast northern sweep. They showed a world already in motion. The lines drawn by cartographers in Amsterdam and Paris were not permanent. They were snapshots of a slow transformation, one that had been underway for centuries and would soon reach its conclusion. The Russian Empire did not wake one morning and decide to claim Tartary. It grew like a tree, roots spreading quietly beneath the soil, branches reaching ever outward. The process had begun long before the maps bore the name. Muscovy had pushed eastward across the Urals in the 16th century, led by Cossack adventurers and fur traders. They followed rivers, built forts, exacted tribute. The forests yielded sable and ermine. The rivers teemed with fish. The land itself seemed to invite movement, endless plains rolling toward horizons that never stopped receding. By the 18th century, that movement had become something more deliberate. Peter the Great looked east and saw not just territory, but possibility. His successors shared that vision. The Russian state began to assert control over lands that had been loosely held by various khanates and tribal confederations. The steppe was no longer a distant mystery. It was a frontier to be measured, mapped, and mastered. The geography worked in Russia's favor. The great Siberian rivers, the Ob, the Yenisei, flowed northward, providing natural highways for exploration and settlement. The terrain was difficult but passable. There were no impassable mountain ranges, no deserts that could not be crossed with enough preparation. The climate was harsh, but the Russians were accustomed to cold. They built their winter forts and waited out the seasons. What they found in Tartary was not an empty land. It was home to numerous peoples: Tatars, Bashkirs, Kazakhs, Buryats, and many others. Each group had its own language, its own customs, its own relationship to the land. Some were nomadic herders who moved with their animals across the grasslands. Others were settled farmers who worked the river valleys. Still others were hunters and fishers who lived close to the forests and waters. The Russian approach varied. Sometimes they negotiated alliances, offering protection in exchange for loyalty and tribute. Sometimes they built forts and simply claimed the surrounding territory, daring anyone to challenge them. Sometimes they used force, overwhelming resistance with better weapons and larger numbers. The pattern repeated across the centuries: a fort established, settlers following, the local population gradually incorporated into the imperial system. The pace quickened in the 18th century. The old khanates that had once controlled parts of the steppe, the Khanate of Kazan, the Khanate of Astrakhan, the Khanate of Siberia, had already fallen. Their territories had been absorbed into the growing Russian state. What remained of Tartary was increasingly open to Russian expansion. The Kazakh steppe presented a particular challenge. The Kazakhs were skilled horsemen, fierce fighters, and deeply attached to their lands. They had resisted outside control for centuries. The Russian approach here was gradual and strategic. They built lines of forts along the northern edge of the steppe, creating a barrier that could be defended and from which expeditions could be launched. They courted Kazakh leaders, offering gifts and promises. They exploited divisions within and between the Kazakh hordes, playing one group against another. By the early 19th century, the Russian presence in Tartary was substantial. The empire stretched from the Baltic Sea in the west to the Pacific Ocean in the east. Its southern border ran along the Caspian and Aral seas, through the Kazakh steppe to the frontiers of China. The lands that had once been labeled on European maps as the mysterious realm of Tartary were now, increasingly, provinces of the Russian Empire. The conquest was not always violent. Much of it was administrative, economic, and demographic. The Russian government encouraged settlement, offering land and privileges to peasants willing to move east. The Trans-Siberian Railway, when it came later in the century, would accelerate this process dramatically. But even before the railroad, the movement of people was steady. Russian villages appeared where nomadic camps had once stood. Orthodox churches rose where Buddhist temples and Muslim mosques had served their communities. The Russian language spread, pushing out or coexisting with the many tongues of the region. Yet there was also resistance. The peoples of Tartary did not simply accept their incorporation into the empire. There were uprisings and revolts, some of them large and prolonged. The Kazakhs rose against Russian control on multiple occasions. The Bashkirs, who had been among the first to feel the weight of Russian expansion, resisted fiercely. In the Caucasus region, at the western edge of what had been Tartary, the resistance was particularly intense. The mountain peoples there fought for decades against the advancing Russian armies. But the empire had time, patience, and resources. Each revolt was suppressed, each rebellion crushed. The Russian military was better organized, better equipped, and more numerous. The imperial administrators were persistent, always finding new ways to extend their control. Fort by fort, settlement by settlement, the frontier moved southward and eastward. The Great Game, that rivalry between Russia and Britain for influence in Central Asia, was still to come in its full intensity, but its foundations were being laid during this period. The British watched Russian expansion with growing alarm. They feared that Russia would push southward into India, threatening the jewel of their empire. The buffer states of Central Asia, the Khanates of Khiva, Bukhara, and Kokand, became the focus of intense diplomatic maneuvering. For the Russians, the conquest of Tartary was a matter of security as much as expansion. The steppe was a source of instability, a gateway through which invaders had come for centuries. By controlling it, they could protect their southern frontiers. They could also gain access to the rich markets of Central Asia and, potentially, to the fabled wealth of the East. The economic motives were real, though often exaggerated in the imagination of observers. The people of Tartary itself, the Tatars and other groups who bore the name, found themselves caught between worlds. They were subjects of a vast empire that did not always understand or respect their ways. Some adapted, embracing the opportunities that the empire offered. Others resisted, clinging to their traditional ways even as the world around them changed. The Russian state, for its part, was never sure how to treat them. Were they allies to be cultivated or subjects to be ruled? The answer shifted with time and circumstance. What the maps called Russian Tartary was becoming something else. It was becoming Siberia, a name that would come to evoke exile, cold, and vast emptiness in the European imagination. It was becoming part of the great Russian landmass, integrated into the empire's economy and administration. The old divisions, independent Tartary, Chinese Tartary, Russian Tartary, were losing their meaning. The transformation was quiet, gradual, almost unnoticed. It did not happen in a single dramatic moment. There was no great battle that decided the fate of Tartary, no treaty that formally ended its existence. Instead, there were thousands of small moments. A fort built here, a road extended there, a village founded, a census taken, a tax collected. Each moment was insignificant in itself. Together, they changed the world. By the middle of the 19th century, the process was nearly complete. The Russian Empire had absorbed most of what the maps had called Tartary. Its borders now reached to the Pacific, to the frontiers of China, to the edge of the Central Asian Khanates. The name Tartary still appeared on some maps, but it was increasingly anachronistic, a relic of an earlier age of cartography. Yet the name had not yet disappeared. It lingered in official documents, in atlases, in the titles of geographical societies. The old understanding of Tartary as a vast, undefined region persisted in popular imagination, even as the reality on the ground changed. The Russian Empire was not yet ready to formally erase the name from its maps. That erasure would come later, as part of a broader process of administrative reform and geographical precision. For now, the frontier was still open. The steppe still stretched endlessly to the south and east. The peoples of Tartary still maintained their languages, their traditions, their ways of life. The Russian presence was real, but not yet total. There was still room for the old world to coexist with the new, for the name Tartary to carry some of its ancient weight. The Great Game was beginning, though no one yet called it that. The pieces were being set on the board: the forts, the trade routes, the diplomatic missions, the military expeditions. The players were taking their positions. The Russian Empire pushing southward, the British Empire watching with concern, the peoples of Central Asia trying to navigate between them. The fate of Tartary was being decided, not in a single stroke, but in the patient accumulation of power and control. The maps would change again. They always did. The lines would shift, the names would be rewritten, the old certainties would dissolve. Tartary, the vast and mysterious land, was becoming something else. Exactly what it would become was not yet clear. But the process was underway, and there was no stopping it. A title wiped away. The ink on the maps had always been a promise. It said, "Here be order, here be names." The Russian Empire understood this better than most. As its surveyors and soldiers pushed deeper into the vastness that cartographers still labeled Tartary, They carried with them not just theodolites and compasses, but a quiet, persistent intention. The land was already theirs by conquest. The next step was to make it theirs by name. The change did not happen overnight. It crept across the century like a slow tide, one revision at a time. In the early 1800s, the old labels still held. You could open an atlas and find Tartary sprawled across the heart of Asia, a single word covering a territory so immense it seemed to swallow the horizon. But the men who drew those lines were already working with new information. They had logs from expeditions, reports from governors, and the growing certainty that the old name no longer matched the reality on the ground. The first cracks appeared in the north. What had once been a vague northern expanse of the Tartar dominion began to acquire a sharper identity. The word Siberia had existed for centuries, but it had been a loose term, a way to describe the cold forests and tundra beyond the Urals. Now it became a formal designation. The Russian government needed to administer its new lands, to collect taxes, to send exiles, to build roads and forts. For that, they needed borders that made sense on paper, so the surveyors drew them. They divided the vastness into provinces, each with its own name, its own governor, its own set of rules. And in the process, the old umbrella term began to shrink. It was not a malicious act at first. It was simply the way of empires. The people who lived in these regions had their own names for themselves, their own identities that had nothing to do with the European label of Tartar. Um, the Tatars of Kazan were not the same as the Buryats of Lac Baikal, who were not the same as the Yakuts of the Lena River. The Russian administrators, eager for precision, began to use these local names in their official documents. It was easier to govern a place when you could call it something specific. And so, piece by piece, the map lost its old unity. Independent Tartary was the first to go. This was the region south of Siberia, a vast stretch of steppe and desert that had once been the heartland of the Mongol Khans. In the 18th century, it had been a convenient label for a land that no one really controlled. But the 19th century brought a different reality. The Russian army was marching south, absorbing the Khanates one by one. The Kokand Khanate fell. The Emirate of Bukhara became a protectorate. The Khanate of Khiva was subdued. Each conquest brought a new name to the map, and each new name chipped away at the old one. By mid-century, the term independent Tartary had become an embarrassment. These places were no longer independent, and they were no longer Tartar in the way the old maps implied. They were becoming part of a new imperial geography, one that preferred the clean lines of modern administration to the romantic vagueness of the past. Chinese Tartary lasted a little longer. This was the region that included Mongolia, Manchuria, and the lands beyond the Great Wall. The Qing dynasty had its own names for these territories, and the European cartographers who followed their maps often deferred to Chinese usage. But even here, the old label was fading. The British and the French were pushing into China, and their maps reflected a new awareness of the region's complexity. Mongolia was not Tartary. It was Mongolia, with its own history, its own people, its own place in the world. The same went for Manchuria, which was increasingly seen as a distinct land, the homeland of the ruling dynasty. By the 1860s, many atlases had quietly dropped Chinese Tartary altogether, replacing it with the names that the Chinese themselves used. Look at an atlas from 1810 and you will see Tartary dominating the center of Asia. Look at an atlas from 1870 and you will see a patchwork of new names: Siberia, Turkestan, Mongolia, Manchuria. The old word is still there, perhaps lingering in the corner of some map, but it is smaller now, less confident. By 1890, it is mostly gone. The maps of the late 19th century show a different world, one where the great blank spaces have been filled with the names of provinces, districts, and protectorates. The empire has made its mark, and the mark is not Tartary. The renaming was not just a matter of cartography. It was a matter of control. When the Russian government established the Governorate General of Western Siberia in 1822, it was making a statement about the nature of the land. This was not a mysterious Tartar realm, a place of legend and rumor. It was a province of the empire, subject to the same laws, the same taxes, the same administration as any other. The same process repeated itself across the century. Each new administrative unit, Each new military district, each new railway line brought the region closer to the imperial center. And with each step, the old name became less relevant. There were practical reasons for this, of course. The Russian Empire was vast, and it needed efficient ways to govern its territories. The old labels, inherited from medieval European maps, were simply not up to the task. They did not correspond to any real political or cultural boundaries. They were, in a sense, fictions. The men who drew the new maps were not trying to erase a civilization. They were trying to understand a land that had been poorly understood for centuries. They wanted to know where the forests ended and the steppe began, where the rivers flowed, where the mountains rose. They wanted to know who lived in these places and how they could be administered. In this sense, the disappearance of Tartary was not a conspiracy. It was a correction. But there was something else at work as well. The 19th century was an age of nationalism, and the European powers were busy defining themselves in opposition to the rest of the world. The old maps, with their exotic labels and their mysterious regions, belonged to an earlier age, one that had been more willing to admit that there were places beyond the reach of European knowledge. The new maps were different. They were confident, precise, and thoroughly European. They divided the world into spheres of influence, into colonies and protectorates, into places that were known and places that were waiting to be known. The name Tartary did not fit into this vision. It was too much a reminder of a time when the world was larger and stranger than the empires wanted it to be. The people who lived in these regions were not consulted. Their own names for their lands, their own sense of identity, were often ignored or overwritten. The term Siberia, for example, was a Russian word, not a native one. It was imposed from the outside, just as Tartary had been imposed centuries before. The difference was that the new names came with the full weight of a modern state behind them. They were printed in official documents, taught in schools, repeated in the newspapers. They became the reality, while the old names faded into the background, references in old books and outdated atlases. By the end of the century, the process was complete. The word Tartary had all but vanished from the maps of the world. It survived only in history books, in the accounts of travelers who had crossed the region before the railways came, in the memories of old men who had been born in a time when the maps still bore the ancient label. The young generation growing up in the new century would never see it on a map. They would learn about Siberia and Turkestan, about Mongolia and Manchuria. They would never know that their grandparents had lived in a place called Tartary. The empire did not need to destroy the name. It simply made it irrelevant. The old maps were not burned. They were simply replaced. The old stories were not suppressed. They were simply forgotten. And so Tartary slipped away with the quiet rustle of pages turning in an atlas, the scratch of a pen crossing out an old label and writing a new one in its place. The land remained, of course. The steppes and forests and mountains were still there, unchanged. But the name, the word that had once covered them like a blanket, was gone. And with it went an entire way of seeing the world, a way that had been replaced by the precise, orderly vision of the modern age. The new names were practical, they were efficient, they allowed the empire to govern, to tax, to build, but they also carried a different kind of meaning. They said, this land belongs to us now. This land is part of our story. The old name had said something else, something about the strangeness and distance of the East, something about the limits of European knowledge. That was gone now, replaced by the confident certainty of the imperial map. The world was smaller, more manageable, more known. And Tartary, the vast and mysterious land that had haunted the imagination of Europe for centuries, was just a memory, a word on an old map, a ghost that would not entirely disappear. The erasure debate, a title wiped away, showed us the slow fading of a name. Region by region, map by map, the word Tartary slipped off the edges of official documents and into the margins of memory. By the end of the 19th century, it was gone from most atlases, replaced by the sharper, cleaner names of Siberia, Central Asia, and the Far East. But a name does not vanish by accident. It is pushed, pulled, and eventually dropped. The question is not whether it disappeared, but why. And that is where the debate begins. Scholars do not agree on a single reason. Instead, they offer three main explanations, each overlapping the others like layers of paint on an old wall. The first is imperial renaming. The second is geographic precision. The third is Eurocentric bias. Together, they form a map of the erasure, not of a land, but of a label. Let us start with the first layer, imperial renaming. The Russian Empire, more than any other power, had the most to gain from making Tartary disappear. As its armies pushed eastward across the Urals and into the vast steppes, the old name carried baggage. Tartary sounded wild, ancient, and ungoverned. It hinted at the Mongol hordes, at Genghis Khan, at a world that predated Russian rule. That was not a useful image for an empire that wanted to present itself as a bringer of order and civilization. So the Russians renamed what they conquered. The lands beyond the Urals became Siberia, a term drawn from the Tatar word for sleeping land. The steppes of the south became the Kyrgyz steppe, then later Kazakhstan. The Khanates of Bukhara, Khiva, and Kokand were folded into the Governorate General of Turkestan. Each new name served a purpose. It erased the old political structures. It replaced them with Russian administrative units. It told the world that these territories were no longer Tartary. They were Russia. This was not a secret or a conspiracy. It was standard imperial practice. Every empire does the same thing. The Spanish renamed the Americas, the British renamed India, the French renamed North Africa. Names are tools of control. They shape how people think about a place. Call a land New Spain and it sounds Spanish. Call it Tartary and it sounds foreign, dangerous, and separate. The Russians understood this deeply. They did not want a separate Tartary inside their borders, but a seamless empire, one name at a time. The second layer is geographic precision. This one is quieter, less political, but just as powerful. As the 19th century progressed, the science of cartography grew more exact. Surveyors measured coastlines, mountains, and rivers with new instruments. Explorers filed reports with precise coordinates. The old maps, with their vague regions and imagined borders, no longer satisfied the demands of the age. Tartary was a problem for these mapmakers. It was too broad, too vague. It covered everything from the Caspian Sea to the Pacific Ocean, from the Arctic coast to the Himalayas. That was not a single region. It was a patchwork of many different lands, peoples, and climates. The name lumped them all together, hiding the distinctions that mattered to scientists, traders, and governments. So, the cartographers broke it apart. They drew new lines where the old ones had been fuzzy. They labeled the northern forests as Siberia. They called the central grasslands the steppe. They named the southern deserts Turkestan. They gave the eastern coast its own set of names, tied to the Chinese and Russian spheres of influence. Each label was more accurate than Tartary. Each one told a traveler what to expect: forest, desert, mountain, or plain. The old name could not survive this kind of scrutiny. It was too imprecise, too lazy. This was not an attack on Tartary itself. It was an evolution of knowledge. Maps are not neutral objects. They are arguments about what the world looks like. When the arguments change, the maps change. Tartary had been useful to medieval and Renaissance cartographers because they knew little about the interior of Asia. It was a blank space, a container for their ignorance. But by the 19th century, the blank spaces were filling in. The container was no longer needed. The third layer is Eurocentric bias. This one is harder to see, but it runs underneath the other two, like a hidden current. European scholars, writers, and officials had long viewed Tartary as a place of backwardness. The name itself carried echoes of the Mongol invasions, of the terror that swept across Europe in the 13th century. Tartars were seen as fierce, cruel, and uncivilized. They were the opposite of Europe, rational, Christian, and progressive. When the Europeans wrote about the lands of Tartary, they did so with a sense of superiority. They described the people as nomads, wanderers, and barbarians. They saw the great cities of the region, Samarkand, Bukhara, Khiva, as relics of a past glory, now fallen into decay. They measured everything against their own standards of progress and found it wanting. This bias shaped how they understood the region. It made it easy to dismiss Tartary as a place that did not matter, a place that could be renamed without loss. This bias also influenced the way history was written. European historians focused on the great empires of the West, Rome, Greece, Britain, France. They treated Asia as a backdrop, a source of invasions and exotic goods, but not as a center of civilization in its own right. Tartary, with its Mongol conquerors and its steppe nomads, fit this pattern perfectly. It was a footnote, a curiosity, a place to be conquered and colonized. Its erasure from the maps was not just a matter of precision, it was a matter of respect. The Europeans did not respect Tartary enough to keep its name. But here we must be careful. The three explanations do not exclude one another. They work together. Imperial renaming gave the Russians a reason to change the labels. Geographic precision gave the mapmakers a method. Eurocentric bias gave both a justification. The result was a slow, steady process that seemed natural at the time. No one woke up one morning and decided to erase Tartary. It just happened, one decision at a time, over the course of a century. There is also a fourth explanation, one that scholars mention more quietly. It is the simple passage of time. Names are fragile things. They depend on memory, on habit, on the daily repetition of speech and writing. When people stop using a name, it fades. The generation that grew up with Tartary on their maps died. The next generation saw Siberia and Turkestan. They did not wonder what had changed. They simply accepted the new labels as the way things were. Erasure, in this sense, is not always deliberate. Sometimes it is just forgetfulness. Yet the debate over Tartary's disappearance is not merely academic. It touches on deeper questions about how we understand the past. Was Tartary a real place, a distinct civilization, or was it always just a name, a convenient label for a vast and varied region? The answer depends on whom you ask. Most historians agree that Tartary was never a unified state. It was a geographic expression like the Middle East or the Far East. It referred to a region, not a nation. Its people were diverse: Tatars, Mongols, Uzbeks, Kazakhs, Manchus, and many others. They shared no single language, religion, or government. The name was an imposition, an outsider's label, but that does not mean it was meaningless. Names have power even when they are imprecise. Tartary shaped how Europeans thought about Asia for centuries. It appeared on maps, in books, in plays, in paintings. It was a symbol of the exotic, the dangerous, the unknown. When it vanished, something was lost. Not a country, perhaps, but a way of seeing the world. The scholarly debate, then, is not just about maps and archives. It is about memory. It is about how we choose to remember or forget the past. Imperial renaming, geographic precision, Eurocentric bias. These are not just abstract forces. They are choices made by people, choices that had consequences. The name Tartary did not have to disappear. It could have survived, like Scandinavia or the Balkans, as a useful regional label, but it did not. And the reasons why are still debated today. Some historians argue that the erasure was a tragedy. They say it wiped away a rich and complex history, replacing it with a simpler, more convenient narrative. Others say it was inevitable, a natural result of better knowledge and clearer boundaries. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in between. The erasure was neither a grand conspiracy nor a harmless accident. It was a process, messy and human, driven by politics, science, and prejudice. As we move forward, we must hold this tension in our minds. Tartary was real, in the sense that it existed on maps and in the minds of millions. It was also unreal, in the sense that it was never a single unified place. Both things are true. The debate over its disappearance is not about choosing one side. It is about understanding how names, maps, and histories are made and unmade over and over again. The name is gone, the lands remain, the people remain, the stories remain, and the questions remain, waiting for us to ask them again. Mud flood myths. Some listeners find the scholarly answers too tidy. They look at a map from 1700, see Tartary written across a vast expanse, and then look at a modern map where the name simply does not exist. The historians say renaming. The historians say shifting borders. But for some, that explanation leaves a hollow space, a question mark. And into that hollow space, wild stories have flowed like water finding a crack in a wall. The most persistent of these stories begins with dirt. Ordinary dirt, but an extraordinary amount of it. The theory claims that Tartary was not merely a name on a map, but a real, powerful, and highly advanced civilization. A great empire with grand cities, sophisticated technology, and a culture that rivaled anything in Europe or Asia. Then, the story goes, something terrible happened. A cataclysm. A flood of mud so vast and so violent that it buried entire cities under layers of earth. sometimes 10 or 20 feet deep. This is not a story told in ancient texts or medieval chronicles. No contemporary account describes such an event. The theory builds itself from absence, not presence. It looks at the fact that many old buildings have lower floors below street level. It looks at the strange fact that some grand structures seem to have been built for a taller people, with doorways and ceilings that dwarf modern humans. It looks at the peculiar uniformity of certain architectural styles across vast distances, and it asks, what if the ground we walk on is not the original ground? What if the world we see is just the top layer of a buried one? The mud flood theory gained traction in the early 21st century, mostly through internet forums and video platforms. It did not emerge from academic circles or archaeological digs. It emerged from pattern recognition. People began to notice things that seemed out of place: a basement window at street level, a staircase leading down to a door that now opens onto solid earth, a massive stone foundation that seems excessive for the modest building sitting on top of it. These observations, gathered and shared across the internet, began to form a narrative. The narrative goes something like this. In the not-too-distant past, perhaps only a few hundred years ago, there existed a global civilization. This civilization was not primitive. It had advanced knowledge of engineering, astronomy, and architecture. It built cities with wide boulevards, grand plazas, and buildings of extraordinary craftsmanship. The style was consistent, whether in Moscow, Beijing, or Vienna. This civilization was called Tartary, and it stretched across much of the northern hemisphere. Then came the mud. A catastrophic flood of liquefied earth swept across the land, burying everything in its path. Cities disappeared under feet of sediment. The survivors, dazed and scattered, had no memory of what had happened. Or perhaps they were silenced by those who took power in the aftermath. The victors rewrote history. They claimed the old buildings as their own. They renamed the territories. They invented new pasts for themselves. And the true story of Tartary was buried along with its cities. The theory explains many things. Its proponents argue. It explains why so many old buildings have underground floors that are now below street level. It explains why some structures appear to be partially submerged, with doors and windows that now open onto dirt. It explains the strange uniformity of certain architectural styles, suggesting a single global culture rather than independent developments. It explains why maps showed Tartary as a vast and coherent region, because it was, in fact, a vast and coherent empire. The evidence for this theory, such as it is, comes from observation rather than documentation. Proponents point to photographs of old buildings with visible ground-level changes. They point to the fact that many European cities have ancient basements that are now several feet below the current street level. They point to the practice, common in many places, of simply building on top of old ruins rather than excavating them. Over centuries, they argue, the ground level rises naturally. But the mud flood theory takes this gradual process and compresses it into a single catastrophic event. There are problems with this theory, and they are substantial. The first is the complete absence of any documentary evidence. A flood of mud covering entire cities would have been observed, recorded, and remembered. It would have left traces in every culture it touched. There are no such records. No chronicle, no letter, no official report, no personal diary mentions a great mud flood. The silence is total. The second problem is geological. Mud floods of the magnitude described would leave distinct layers in the soil. Geologists have studied the strata of countless regions across the world, and no such layer exists. The theory would require a global event that somehow escaped the notice of every geologist, every paleontologist, and every soil scientist who has ever studied the ground beneath our feet. The third problem is architectural. The buildings that proponents point to as evidence of Tartary's greatness are well documented. They have known construction dates, known architects, known patrons. The star forts, the grand palaces, the elaborate cathedrals, all of them have clear histories. The idea that they were built by a mysterious civilization that vanished without a trace contradicts the overwhelming documentary evidence of their origins. But the mud flood theory persists, and it persists for a reason. It speaks to a human need for mystery, for hidden truths, for the sense that the world is not quite what it seems. The idea that we are walking on the rooftops of a lost civilization is romantic. It transforms the mundane act of crossing a street into a journey over buried history. It makes the past feel present, hidden just beneath our feet. There is also a certain appeal in the idea of a great civilization that was deliberately erased. It suggests that history is not a neutral record, but a tool of power. Those who write the history control the narrative. Those who control the narrative control the present. The mud flood theory, in this sense, is not really about mud or floods or even Tartary itself. It is about the suspicion that the official story is incomplete, that someone is hiding something, that the past is not as tidy as the textbooks suggest. This suspicion is not entirely unfounded. History is full of erasures. Conquerors have always rewritten the past to suit their present needs. Names change, borders shift, peoples are forgotten. But the mud flood theory takes this valid insight and pushes it to an extreme, inventing a cataclysm for which there is no evidence and a civilization for which there are no records. The theory also relies on a misunderstanding of how cities grow. In many old cities, the street level has risen over time, not because of a sudden flood, but because of gradual accumulation. Debris, refuse, and the rubble of demolished buildings all contribute to the rising ground. When a building collapses, the new one is often built on top of the ruins. Over centuries, this process can raise the ground level significantly. A basement that was once at street level can end up several feet below it. This is not evidence of a cataclysm. It is evidence of time. The mud flood theory finds its most fertile ground online, where images can be shared without context and claims can be made without consequence. A photograph of a strange-looking building, a screenshot of an old map, a video of a basement window, these fragments can be assembled into a narrative that feels convincing, even as it lacks any scholarly foundation. The internet allows such theories to spread quickly, to find communities of believers, to grow and evolve as new pieces of evidence are discovered. There is a certain poetry to the theory. The idea that the world is layered, that beneath the surface of our everyday lives there lies a buried past, is a powerful metaphor. It resonates with our sense that history is not a straight line, but a palimpsest, a manuscript that has been written over again and again. The mud flood theory takes this metaphor and makes it literal. The past is not just beneath us in a metaphorical sense, it is beneath us in a physical sense, waiting to be uncovered. But the poetry does not make it true. The evidence, when examined carefully, does not support the theory. The absence of documentary records, the lack of geological traces, the well-documented origins of the buildings in question, all of these point to a different conclusion. The cities were not buried by a sudden flood. They were built, inhabited, and in some cases abandoned. The ground rose gradually, as it always does. The name Tartary disappeared from maps because maps changed, not because the civilization it represented was wiped from the earth. We want the world to be more than it seems. We want there to be something beneath the surface waiting to be discovered. The mud flood myth gives us that. It gives us a world where the ground beneath our feet is not solid, but full of buried stories. Conspiracy of silence. The mud flood myth left a question hanging in the air. If Tartary was so grand, so advanced, then why did no one speak of it? The answer, for a growing number of people, was simple. Someone did not want them to speak. The silence was not accidental, it was enforced. This belief did not come from old manuscripts or dusty archives. It grew in the soil of the internet, where anyone could publish a theory and find an audience. The idea took hold that Tartary was not a vague label on old maps. It was a real civilization, vast and powerful, with cities of white stone and canals of clean water. It had libraries and observatories. It had a technology that rivaled our own, perhaps surpassed it. And then, in a single stroke, it was gone. In the 18th and 19th centuries, the great powers of Europe were carving up the world. They needed land, resources, and labor. They also needed legitimacy. A conquered people could be ruled, but a vanished civilization could be denied. So the victors rewrote the history books. They renamed the cities. They burned the records. They replaced the old maps with new ones, carefully stripped of the name Tartary. And they made sure no one remembered what came before. This is the conspiracy of silence. It is not a theory about a single event. It is a theory about a pattern. Every piece of evidence that seems to contradict the official story, an old building with strange proportions, a map with a missing region, a painting with an unfamiliar flag, is folded into the same narrative. Each one is proof of the cover up. Each one is a crack in the wall of silence. The believers point to the maps themselves. On an 18th century map, Tartary is a giant spanning from the Caspian Sea to the Pacific Ocean. It is divided into parts, but it is still there, a named land with borders and cities. Then, in the 19th century, the name disappears. The same territory is now called Siberia, or Central Asia, or the Russian Empire. The borders change, the cities get new names, the people are reclassified. To the believer, this is not the slow work of cartographers. It is a deliberate act of erasure. They also point to the buildings. In Moscow, in St. Petersburg, in cities across Russia and Central Asia, there are structures that seem too grand, too precise, too old. The official history says they were built by Russian architects in the 18th or 19th century. But the believers see something else. They see the work of Tartary, a civilization that built in stone while Europe still lived in wood. They see columns and arches that do not match the official timeline. They see a style that is too consistent, too advanced to be the work of a single empire. And they point to the archives. Why are so many records from the Tartary period missing? Why did the maps change so suddenly? Why did the names shift without explanation? The believers argue that this is not the natural decay of history. It is the work of censors who went through the libraries and removed every trace of the old order. They did not destroy everything, of course. That would be too obvious. They left enough to confuse, enough to mislead, but not enough to prove. The silence is maintained not by absence, but by distortion. The rise of this theory is a modern phenomenon. It began in the early days of the internet, on forums and blogs where amateur historians shared scans of old maps and photographs of strange buildings. The tone was often conversational, even playful. Someone would post a map of Tartary and ask, "What happened here?" Someone else would reply with a theory. The thread would grow, the ideas would spread, but the tone changed over time. The conversations became more serious. The theories became more elaborate. The believers began to see themselves as truth seekers, digging through the lies of the establishment. They developed a vocabulary: mud flood for the cataclysm, star fort for the buildings, great Tartary for the lost empire, and the silence for the cover-up itself. The believers see themselves as the only ones who dare to speak. They comb through the old maps, looking for the name Tartary that was scratched out and replaced. They zoom in on the paintings, looking for the flags and symbols that do not match the official story. They measure the buildings, looking for the proportions that suggest a different kind of engineering. Every discovery is shared, celebrated, and added to the growing body of evidence. But the evidence is often thin. The maps can be explained by the natural evolution of cartography. The buildings can be dated to known periods. The archives can be accounted for by the chaos of war and revolution. The believers do not accept these explanations. They see them as further proof of the conspiracy. The more the historians explain, the more the believers distrust. The silence becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more it is denied, the more it is believed. Partly, it is the appeal of the underdog. The believers see themselves as fighting against a powerful establishment that controls the flow of information. They are the Davids against the Goliaths of academia. Every dismissive article, every condescending tweet, every scholarly rebuttal only strengthens their resolve. The establishment is trying to silence them, just as it's silenced Tartary. The parallel is too perfect to be coincidence. And partly it is the appeal of the mystery itself. The disappearance of Tartary from the maps is a real historical puzzle. It happened, and it happened for reasons that are complex and layered. The official explanation, imperial renaming, geographic precision, Eurocentric bias, is not wrong, but it is not satisfying either. It is a story of bureaucratic decisions and gradual changes. It lacks drama, it lacks villains. The conspiracy theory fills that gap. It offers a story with a clear villain and a clear victim. It offers a story that can be told in a single sentence. Tartary existed, it was destroyed. The truth was hidden. The rise of online speculation has made this story more visible, but it has not made it more true. The forums and blogs are full of theories, but they are thin on evidence. The believers often cite each other, creating a closed loop of confirmation. A map is posted on one site, discussed on another, then cited as proof on a third. The original source is forgotten. The theory becomes the fact. The historians who study this phenomenon note that it follows a familiar pattern. It is the same pattern as other conspiracy theories, from the faked moon landing to the secret world government. The structure is always the same. There is a hidden elite, a suppressed truth, and a heroic minority who knows the real story. The details change, but the shape does not. But the voice is gone. The people who lived in the lands called Tartary did not vanish. They became Tatars, Kazakhs, Uzbeks, Russians, Siberians. They speak different languages now, worship different gods, live in different countries. They do not remember the name Tartary because it was never their name. It was a name given by others, a name that described a region on a map, not a nation in the world. The conspiracy of silence is a modern myth. It is a way of making sense of the past, but it is not the past itself. It is a story that grows in the dark, fed by suspicion and fueled by the internet. It is a story that will continue to spread because it is a good story. But it is not a true one. The silence is not a conspiracy, it is a consequence. Tartary faded from the maps because the world moved on, because empires rose and fell, because names change and borders shift. The silence is not something that was imposed, it is something that happened, and no amount of speculation can break it. Architectural ghosts. And so the story moved from the silence of archives to the silence of stone. The conspiracy theories did not stay in dusty books or glowing screens. They walked out into the world and pointed at buildings. They looked at old structures, at grand facades, at walls that had stood for centuries, and they whispered a single word: Tartary. The claim was simple. Certain buildings, especially those with grand columns, ornate brickwork, and massive proportions, could not have been built by the people who lived around them. The official histories said these structures were built in the 18th or 19th century. The theorists said no. They said these were remnants of a lost civilization, a great Tartarian empire that spanned the globe. They said the buildings were not built by the known architects and laborers. They were inherited. They were leftovers. One of the most common examples was the Star Fort. These were fortifications shaped like stars, with angled bastions pointing outward. They were scattered across Europe, and some existed in the Americas and Asia. The conspiracy narratives claimed these were not military structures. They were energy grids, or ancient city layouts, or defensive works against a global flood. The evidence of their actual purpose, the long history of siege warfare and artillery defense, was pushed aside. But the buildings themselves were real. They stood in the open, inviting interpretation. Castles in France, manor houses in England, government buildings in the United States, and cathedrals in Russia. The theorists looked at their symmetry, their stonework, their sheer scale, and they saw something alien. They saw a fingerprint of a lost world. Take, for example, the grand buildings of St. Petersburg. The city was built on a swamp, drained and shaped by the will of a czar. The palaces and cathedrals rose over decades, with each stone placed by a worker who had a name and a wage. The records of these workers exist. The names of the architects exist. The plans exist. There is no hidden hand. But the theorists did not look at the records. They looked at the walls. They measured the proportions. They counted the bricks. They decided that the effort required was too great, and therefore the official story was wrong. This was a strange logic. It said that human achievement was impossible, that our ancestors were too weak, too few, or too stupid to build what we see today. It denied the power of patience, of generations of accumulated skill. Another example was the Washington Monument in the United States. It was an obelisk, simple in shape, massive in scale. The conspiracy narratives claimed it was a surviving Tartarian structure, repurposed by the new American government. The evidence showed it was built in the 19th century, over a period of decades, with a visible change in the color of the stone where construction paused and resumed. The builders were known, the engineers were known. The delays were due to lack of funds in the Civil War. The records were complete. The star forts were a frequent subject of these claims, their angled walls and precise geometry inviting speculation. Yet their true history was well documented. They were designed by military engineers who wrote treatises on fortification. They were built in response to the development of gunpowder artillery, which could smash old high walls but struggled against low, angled bastions that deflected cannon fire. The star shape was not mystical, it was practical. It allowed defenders to cover every approach with crossfire, leaving no blind spot for an attacker to exploit. The builders of these forts were not preserving an ancient secret. They were solving a contemporary problem, and they did so with mathematics, engineering, and hard labor. The problem was scale. Some of these buildings were enormous. They took decades to build. They required thousands of workers. They consumed vast resources. To a modern eye, this seemed impossible. We live in an age of machines, and we forget what human labor can do when organized and sustained over time. We forget that the pyramids were built without cranes, that the cathedrals of Europe rose without steel beams, that the great walls of China were laid without concrete trucks. But they were not something else. They were us, with fewer tools and more time. They were us, with stronger backs and simpler lives. They were us before we forgot how to wait. The theorists pointed to the gaps in the record. They said the official histories were incomplete. They were right. The records were incomplete. No archive holds every name, every order, every payment, every mistake. No ledger records the sweat of every worker, the curses of every foreman, the prayers of every mason. History is a map, not a photograph. It shows the major roads, not every footstep. There was a particular type of building that drew the most attention. It was the old mansion, the grand house, the civic hall with its columns and its dome. These buildings were often built in the neoclassical style, which borrowed from ancient Greece and Rome. The style was popular in the 18th and 19th centuries when the new nations of the world wanted to look like the old republics. The architects copied the forms and the builders executed them, and the result was a landscape of white stone and tall columns. The classical tradition was a thread that ran through the centuries. It was broken, frayed, and rewoven, but it was never cut. The builders of the 18th century were not inventing a new style. They were reviving an old one. They were reading the same texts that the Romans read. They were copying the same forms that the Greeks carved. They were part of a long conversation that stretched back to the ancient world. The conspiracy theories cut that thread. They said the classical forms were not revivals. They were survivals. They said the buildings were not copies of ancient models. They were the originals, built by a lost civilization that the ancient Greeks and Romans also copied. They said the entire history of architecture was upside down. For some, they were proof of human skill. For others, they were proof of human loss. For the conspiracy theorists, they were proof of a lie. They were the ghostly reminders of a world that never was, a world that somehow left its footprints in brick and marble. And so the buildings waited, patient as always, for the story to pass. The story would pass. All stories pass. But the buildings would remain, standing in the quiet sun, their stones speaking a language that no one could fully translate. They were not ghosts. They were witnesses. They had seen the hands that built them, the generations that used them, and the theories that claimed them. They had seen it all, and they said nothing. The silence of the stone was the loudest sound of all. It was the sound of patience, of endurance, of the long, slow work of time. It was the sound of a world that was not lost, but found. It was the sound of history, waiting for anyone who cared to listen. They deserved to be seen for what they were. They deserved to be understood as the product of real people with real names, real skills, and real lives. They deserved to be honored for the work that went into them, the decades of labor, the generations of craft. But the myth was easier. The myth was a shortcut. The myth was a way to look at a building and feel wonder without doing the work of learning. The myth was a way to feel special, to feel that you knew a secret, to feel that you were seeing through the lie. And so the buildings stood caught in the crossfire of fact and fancy, their stones silent, their roofs open to the sky, their doors open to the curious. They did not choose their stories, they simply stood. Starfort enigmas. The same eye that lingered on those grand old buildings, tracing their unfamiliar lines, turns naturally to another shape in the ground. It is a shape that repeats across continents, a star etched into the earth. The fascination with these fortifications is real. and it is old. But the stories that now cling to them, like ivy on a ruined wall, have grown wild and thick, obscuring the stone beneath. Consider the Star Fort. It is a thing of angles and points, of bastions that jut out from a central core. To the modern eye, it can look alien, a geometric puzzle dropped into a landscape. Its purpose was not art, though it possesses a stark beauty. Its purpose was violence, calculated and cold. The design was a response to a simple problem: how to defend a wall without a blind spot. A straight wall has a weakness. An attacker can approach its base, and the defenders above cannot see or fire upon them without leaning out and exposing themselves. The star shape solved this. Each point, each bastion, allowed defenders to fire along the faces of the adjacent walls. There was no dead ground. Every inch of the approach could be swept by gunfire. It was a machine for killing, designed with a mathematician's precision. The innovation did not come from a lost civilization. It came from a very specific time and place. It was a child of the gunpowder age. As cannons grew more powerful in the 15th and 16th centuries, the old high stone walls of castles became death traps. A cannonball could smash through them, sending deadly stone shards flying. The engineers of Italy, a land of rival city-states and constant warfare, were the first to truly develop the answer. They lowered the walls, thickened them, and packed earth behind them to absorb the shock of impact. They built them in the shape of a star, the trace Italienne, to bring every angle under fire. It was a revolution in military architecture, and it spread across Europe like a wave. Now, this is where the story takes its strange turn. The Star Fort, a product of Renaissance engineering, becomes a ghost in the conspiracy narratives. The claim is made that these forts are not from the known historical period. They are said to be far older, the remnants of a vast and advanced civilization that once ruled a great empire. This is the Tartary of the myth, a realm of high culture and technological marvel, not the sparsely populated frontier shown on old maps. The forts, with their strange and beautiful geometry, are offered as proof. They are said to be too perfect, too complex, too widespread to be the work of the simple peoples who are recorded in history. The argument often begins with a sense of wonder, which is understandable. The forts are impressive, but then it takes a leap away from evidence and into a realm of pure speculation. The sheer number of these forts is cited as a problem. How could so many have been built in such a short time? The answer, the myth suggests, is that they were not. They were built by an older, mightier power, a power that was later wiped from the record. The fact that the forts are found in places like North America, far from the Italian city-states, is presented as further proof. They could not be the work of the colonial powers, the story goes. They must be the work of a pre-existing, unknown empire. This misuse of the Star Fort ignores the very history that created it. The spread of the design was not a mystery. It was a documented process of knowledge transfer. As European powers expanded across the globe, they carried their military science with them. The forts were not built by an unknown empire. They were built by the known empires of Spain, France, Britain, and Russia, among others. They are the physical footprints of colonialism, of the competition for the New World and for Asia. To see them and think of a vanished Tartary is to ignore the very real and often brutal history of the people who designed, built, and garrisoned them. The geographical spread is not a mystery either. It is a map of European ambition. The star forts of the Caribbean were built to protect sugar wealth. The star forts of India were built to project the power of the East India Company. The star forts of North America were built to secure fur trades and strategic river junctions. Each one has a paper trail. There are contracts, letters, and drawings. We know the names of the engineers. We know the dates of construction. The evidence is not hidden. It is archived. It is written in the very stones, in the style of the masonry, in the type of cannon they were designed to mount. The Star Fort becomes a symbol for a specific kind of thinking. It is a way of seeing the world not as it is, but as a puzzle to be solved with a single grand theory. It is a way of discounting the messy, complex, and often unglamorous work of historians who piece together the past from fragments. The forts are not a code to be cracked. They are a book to be read. And the book is not written in a lost language. It is written in the familiar language of early modern Europe, with its wars, its kings, and its endless quest for power. The shape itself, the star, holds a powerful allure. It is a symbol of order imposed on a chaotic landscape. It is a mark of civilization, of control. The conspiracy narrative seizes on this. It sees the star as a signature, a brand left by a great builder. But the signature is not that of a mysterious Tartary. It is the signature of a military revolution that changed the world. It is the signature of an age of gunpowder and sail, of empires that spanned the globe. The forts are not ghosts. They are documents, solid and enduring, that speak of a past that is well understood, even if we sometimes choose not to listen. The confusion arises in part from the sheer age of some of these structures. A fort built in the 16th century is old. It feels ancient. It is easy to imagine it as belonging to a time before recorded history. But a few centuries is not an eternity. The gap between the building of a star fort and the present day is a blink of an eye in the long span of human existence. The people who built them are not so different from us. They had the same hopes and fears. They were not giants, and they did not possess lost knowledge. They were engineers and soldiers and laborers, working with the tools and ideas of their time. The mystery is not in the forts themselves. The mystery is in our willingness to believe in a story that is so much more elaborate and fantastical than the simple human truth. As the gaze leaves the star fort, it returns to the ground, to the earth that holds these structures. The fascination with the shape will likely continue. It is a beautiful shape. But the story of the Star Fort is not a story of a lost world. It is a story of our own world, of its relentless ambition and its constant state of conflict. It is a story written in stone and earth, and it is a story we have already been told. The enigma is not the fort. The enigma is our desire to make it something it is not. And with that, the mind, having traced the points of the star, can rest, knowing the simple geometry of its true origin. What historians say: the star forts stand silent, their angles sharp against the sky. People point to them and whisper about lost empires. But historians see something different. They see the work of known hands in known times for known reasons. The evidence begins with the maps themselves. Cartography did not lose Tartary by accident. It changed by design, one careful revision at a time. The name appeared on medieval charts because medieval mapmakers drew what they had heard, not what they had seen. They filled empty spaces with labels from travelers' tales. Tartary was such a label. It meant the land of the Tatars, a vast unknown stretching beyond the reach of European knowledge. As explorers returned with better information, the maps grew more accurate. Rivers found their true courses. Mountains settled into proper ranges. Coastlines stopped wandering. The blank spaces shrank, and the labels changed to match what was actually there. Siberia appeared because Russians walked across it and wrote down what they found. Central Asia appeared because surveyors measured it and drew its borders. Tartary faded not because someone erased it, but because it was never a real place with real boundaries. It was a placeholder for ignorance, and ignorance was retreating. The archival record tells the same story. State papers, church records, and trade ledgers from the 17th and 18th centuries show no great civilization hidden in the steppe. They show nomads, towns, caravans, and small kingdoms. The Russian Empire kept meticulous records as it expanded eastward. Its administrators counted people, measured land, and collected taxes. They found no grand cities buried beneath the earth. They found villages, forts, and grazing lands. The Chinese Empire did the same on its own borders. Its officials mapped the frontier and dealt with the peoples who lived there. None of them reported a lost world. Archaeology adds its own quiet testimony. Digging in the regions once labeled Tartary reveals the same layers found everywhere else in Eurasia. Bronze Age burials, Scythian kurgan mounds, medieval towns, and modern settlements follow each other in proper sequence. There is no missing millennium. There is no sudden layer of catastrophic destruction covering a brilliant civilization. The material culture matches the historical record. Pottery, tools, coins, and building foundations all confirm what the documents say. The people of these lands lived ordinary lives, shaped by the same forces of climate, trade, and politics that shaped everywhere else. The conspiracy theories often point to old buildings as proof of a hidden past. But those buildings have their own paper trails. Star forts, for example, were designed by military engineers who wrote manuals about them. Their construction dates are recorded, their costs are itemized, their architects are named. The style spread across Europe and its colonies in the 16th and 17th centuries because cannon fire demanded new defenses. The old high walls could not withstand artillery. The low, angled bastions could. This is not speculation. It is documented fact. The same applies to other structures that conspiracy theorists claim for Tartary. Grand buildings in Moscow, St. Petersburg, and other cities were built by known architects, using known materials over known periods. The labor forces are recorded, the funding sources are traced, the construction methods are understood. There is no mystery here, only the ordinary work of human hands across centuries. The name Tartary itself deserves attention. It came from the Tatars, a Turkic-speaking people of the Mongolian steppe. Medieval Europeans heard the name and connected it to Tartarus, the Greek underworld. The pun was irresistible. The Tatars became the people of hell, and their lands became Tartary. The name carried fear and prejudice, not geography. When Europeans finally traveled through these regions, they found the reality far more complex than the legend. The Tatars were not demons. They were traders, herders, warriors, and farmers. Their societies were sophisticated in their own ways, with laws, literature, and cities of their own. The Russian Empire's expansion into these lands was not a conquest of a single great nation. It was a slow, grinding process of absorbing many smaller peoples. The Russians built forts, established trade routes, and settled colonists. They fought wars, made treaties, and imposed their administration. The peoples they encountered had their own histories, their own loyalties, and their own conflicts. Some resisted, some accommodated, some allied with the Russians against their own enemies. The result was a patchwork of territories that eventually formed the Russian Empire's eastern provinces. None of this required the destruction of a grand civilization. It required only the ordinary brutality of empire building. The maps show this process in action. Early Russian maps labeled the eastern territories as Tartary because the mapmakers did not know better. Later maps used regional names because the mapmakers knew exactly what was there. The change was not a conspiracy. It was progress. Each new survey corrected the errors of the previous one. Each new report refined the picture. The name Tartary survived longest in the most remote and least known regions. As those regions became better understood, the name retreated until it vanished entirely. Modern historians have traced this cartographic evolution in detail. They have compared maps from different centuries, noted the changes, and explained them through the documentary record. The process was gradual, uneven, and sometimes contradictory. Different mapmakers used different conventions. Some clung to old names longer than others. But the overall direction is clear. Tartary was not erased, it was outgrown. The archival evidence is equally clear. The Russian Empire's foreign ministry kept detailed records of its dealings with the peoples of the East. These records show no awareness of a great lost civilization. They show practical diplomacy with real living peoples. The Chinese Empire's records are similar. Its officials dealt with the Mongols, the Uyghurs, and other groups as distinct political entities. They did not treat them as remnants of a fallen empire. They treated them as what they were, complex societies with their own interests and agendas. Archaeology confirms this picture. Excavations at sites across the former Tartary have uncovered the remains of ordinary life. There are no grand palaces hidden beneath the steppe. There are no advanced machines waiting to be discovered. There are the modest remains of human communities, each with its own character and history. The material culture matches what the documents describe. The people of these lands lived within the limits of their technology and environment, just as people everywhere do. The mud flood theory fails for a simple reason. A catastrophic flood of the kind it describes would leave evidence. It would deposit layers of sediment across vast areas. It would destroy structures in a particular way. It would be visible in the geological record. No such layer exists. The soils of the regions once called Tartary show normal development over thousands of years. There are flood deposits in river valleys, of course, but they are local and ordinary. They do not indicate a global catastrophe. The idea that victors erased Tartary from history also fails. The supposed victors were the Russian and Chinese empires. Both kept extensive records. Neither had any reason to hide the existence of a great civilization. In fact, both would have celebrated such a discovery. It would have enhanced their prestige. They did not celebrate because there was nothing to celebrate. The lands they conquered were inhabited by many peoples, each with their own history. None of those histories included a lost golden age. The scholarly consensus is clear. Tartary was a geographic label, not a civilization. It referred to a vast region of Central and Northern Asia that Europeans understood poorly. As European knowledge improved, the label became obsolete. The peoples of the region had their own names, their own histories, and their own identities. Those identities survived the disappearance of the European label. The Tatars of Russia, the Kazakhs, the Uyghurs, and many other groups all trace their ancestry to the peoples who once lived in the lands called Tartary. Their histories are real, documented, and complex. They do not need a mythical empire to give them meaning. The evidence fits together like a puzzle. Maps show the gradual refinement of geographic knowledge. Archives show the practical administration of real territories. Archaeology shows the material remains of ordinary human life. None of these sources support the idea of a lost civilization. They support the simpler, more human story of peoples living their lives, adapting to their environments, and interacting with their neighbors. That story is not as dramatic as a hidden empire, but it is true. Tartars in literature. The ink of history writes in strange loops. The previous chapter closed with the scholar's quiet dismissal, the careful hand of the historian brushing away the mud and the myth. But the story of Tartary did not live only in archives and maps. It lived in the imagination of readers, in the candlelit rooms of poets, in the crowded theaters of London, and in the leather-bound travelogues that sat on noble shelves. Words carried Tartary across Europe long before the borders were drawn or erased. The first voice to speak of Tartars to the Western ear was that of Marco Polo. His journey, taken in the late 13th century, was not a tale of maps, but of men. He rode through the vast steppe and into the court of Kublai Khan, and his words painted a picture of a world both strange and ordered. He called the people Tartars, though he knew them as Mongols. His book, The Travels, became a sensation, read aloud in halls and copied by hand. He described their tents, their horses, their customs. He told of how they drank fermented mare's milk, how they moved with the seasons, how their armies struck like thunder. His account was not a fantasy. It was observation, filtered through wonder. But wonder, once written, becomes a seed, and seeds grow in the soil of the reader's mind. Polo's Tartars were not monsters. They were conquerors, yes, and their reputation preceded them. But he spoke of their justice, their loyalty, their skill in war. He gave them dimension. He wrote of their cities, their trade routes, their silk and their silver. For the European reader, this was a revelation. The East was not a blank space. It was full of people, full of life, full of power. And the name he used, Tartars, carried a weight that would not be shaken. But Polo was not the only traveler. A century later, a Franciscan friar named William of Rubruck walked the same step, sent by the King of France to seek an alliance. His account was more sober, more detailed. He noted the language, the food, the rituals. He corrected some of Polo's exaggerations, or at least offered a different lens. He described the Tartars as practical, hardy, and deeply superstitious. He wrote of their shamans, their sky worship, their indifference to European notions of comfort. His book was less popular, but it fed the same hunger. The West wanted to know who these people were, and each writer offered a piece of the answer. By the 14th century, the name Tartar had become a fixture in European letters. It appeared in chronicles, in sermons, in poems. The word itself carried a dark echo. Some scholars of the time, fond of false etymology, claimed it came from Tartarus, the Greek word for the abyss, the underworld. This was a mistake, a confusion of sound and meaning, but it stuck. The Tartars were not just a people. They were a force from the deep, a scourge sent to punish a sinful world. The church repeated this idea, and the laity believed it. The name became a curse as much as a label. Yet the literature did not stay fixed in fear. As the centuries turned, the Tartars shifted shape in the European imagination. In the 15th and 16th centuries, as the Ottoman Empire pressed on the edges of Christendom, writers began to draw parallels. The Tartars were compared to the Turks, both seen as Eastern threats, both wrapped in the same cloth of menace. But there was also a fascination. The Tartar was exotic, otherworldly, a figure of both dread and desire. Poets used the image of the Tartar camp, the great tent cities, the endless horsemen, to evoke the sublime, the awe that borders on terror. The stage, too, caught the fever. English playwrights of the Elizabethan era found the Tartar a useful character. He could be a villain, a tyrant, a foil to the noble European hero, but he could also be a mirror, reflecting the ambitions and cruelties of the audience's own rulers. The Tartar was a blank canvas, painted with the colors of the playwright's intent. Shakespeare, as ever, knew how to use a name. In Macbeth, the witch's brew includes Tartar's lips, a small detail, but one that shows how deeply the word had sunk into the common tongue. In Much Ado About Nothing, a character jokes about being married to a fair lady and then compares a man to a Tartar, meaning a fierce or stubborn one. These are not grand portraits, they are brushstrokes, quick and sharp. They show that the Tartar was a known quantity, a type, a shorthand for the fierce and the foreign. But Shakespeare did more than that. In King John, he speaks of the Tartar's bow, a weapon that bends back upon itself, a metaphor for the way power can turn against its wielder. In Henry V, the king warns his soldiers that they must be as hard as the Tartar's bow. The image is one of resilience, of tension held in service of a goal. The Tartar here is not a villain. He is a standard of strength, a model of endurance. Shakespeare took the name and made it flexible, bending it to his dramatic needs. The 18th century brought a new tone. The Enlightenment valued reason, and writers approached Tartary with a cooler eye. They wanted to classify, to understand, to place the Tartar within a system of human types. The French philosopher Montesquieu wrote of the Tartars in his Spirit of the Laws, using them to illustrate theories about climate and governance. He argued that the vast, open steppe produced a certain kind of society, mobile, martial, and resistant to fixed rule. This was not a poem or a play. It was analysis, but it carried the same assumptions. The Tartar was still other, still defined by his difference from the European norm. The novel, too, found the Tartar useful. In the sprawling fictions of the period, a Tartar might appear as a wise old man, a savage warrior, or a mysterious emissary from the East. These characters were rarely central, but they added color, a dash of the exotic to a familiar plot. The Tartar was a stock figure, a type that readers recognized without needing explanation. He was the horseman, the archer, the man of the tent and the wind. But there was another strand, more sympathetic, that ran through the literature. Some writers, having read the accounts of Polo and others, saw the Tartars not as monsters, but as a proud and ancient people. They were descendants of great empires, heirs to the legacy of Genghis Khan. Their way of life, harsh and free, was romanticized. The Tartar became a symbol of liberty, of the untamed spirit that the civilized West had lost. In this telling, the steppe was not a wasteland. It was a land of pure air and open sky, where a man could be his own master. This vision appealed to poets and philosophers who chafed against the constraints of court and city. The Romantic poets, in particular, seized on this image. They wrote of the Tartar as a figure of sublime power, a rider who could cross the world in a single day. The vastness of Tartary became a metaphor for the unbounded imagination, the limitless reach of the human soul. The name itself, with its ancient echoes, carried a music that the poets loved. It appeared in verse as a token of the far away, the long ago, the mysterious, and the mighty. By the 19th century, the Tartar had become a literary fixture, a character who could be summoned with a word. He appeared in adventure novels, in historical romances, in the popular press. The name no longer needed introduction. Everyone knew what a Tartar was, even if the knowledge was vague, a mix of fact and fable. The literature had done its work, weaving the Tartar into the fabric of European culture. Portraits of a people words had carried the Tartars across Europe long before brushes and ink tried to capture them. Marco Polo wrote, and then the illustrators came. They worked from imagination more often than from life. A traveler returned with a story, and an artist in Venice or Nuremberg turned it into a picture. The results were strange, beautiful, and rarely accurate. The earliest prints showed Tartars as monsters. That was not cruelty, not exactly. It was fear dressed as wonder. Medieval artists had a language for the edges of the world, and they used it freely. Tartars appeared with dog heads in some manuscripts. In others, they had faces on their chests. One famous woodcut showed them eating raw flesh, their eyes wide and wild. These images did not come from observation. They came from the old Greek habit of filling unknown lands with marvels. If a place was far away, it must be full of things that made no sense at home. By the 16th century, something shifted. Travelers brought back real descriptions, and artists began to listen. The Tartars in these later prints look like people. They wear long robes, fur hats, and boots with turned up toes. Their faces are broad, their eyes are dark, and their beards are thin. Some prints show them on horseback, small and tough, riding across endless plains. Others place them in tents drinking fermented mare's milk from wooden bowls. The artists still exaggerated, but they exaggerated what they had heard, not what they had invented. The mix of fascination and disdain runs through every image. Look at a 16th century engraving of a Tartar chief. The artist gives him dignity. He sits tall, his posture straight, his gaze level. His clothes are rich, decorated with fur and metal. He looks like a king, and the artist seems to admire him. Then the same artist adds a detail that undercuts the portrait. A skull hangs from the chief's saddle, his horse is spattered with mud, his face is hard, unreadable, and slightly cruel. The admiration and the disgust share the same frame. That double feeling came from history. Europeans had reasons to fear the Tartars. The Mongol invasions were not ancient memory. They were recent trauma. The Golden Horde had ruled parts of Russia for 2 centuries. The Ottomans, who claimed descent from steppe warriors, still threatened Europe in the 1500s. Every artist knew someone who had heard a story about the Horde. The fear was real, and it shaped the hand that held the pen. Some portraits went further. They tried to show the Tartars as noble savages, free and wild in a way that Europeans had lost. These images show riders on the steppe, their faces turned to the wind. There is a longing in them, a quiet envy. The artist imagines a life without walls, without kings, without the weight of courts and cathedrals. The Tartar becomes a symbol of freedom, even as he remains a symbol of danger. The two ideas sit together, uncomfortable and inseparable. The prints traveled widely. They appeared in books about the East, in atlases and illustrated histories. They shaped what Europeans thought they knew. A merchant in Amsterdam might never meet a Tartar, but he had seen the picture. He had studied the robe, the bow, the horse. He felt he understood. The images became a kind of knowledge, thin and distorted, but persistent. Some artists worked from life. They met Tartar envoys who came to European courts, and they drew what they saw. These portraits are different. They lack the wildness of the imagined scenes. The subjects look tired, out of place, dressed in unfamiliar clothes. One famous portrait from the 17th century shows a Tartar ambassador in Vienna. He stands stiff and formal, his face polite but wary. The artist captured the awkwardness of the meeting, the vast distance between worlds. The fascination is there, but so is the sadness. Other artists never left their studios. They copied from earlier prints, adding their own flourishes. Errors multiplied, a robe changed color, a hat gained a feather, a face became more angular. By the 8th century, the Tartar in European art was a fixed type, a character in a costume. He appeared in operas, in paintings, in decorative panels. He had lost his specific history. He had become an idea. The idea was flexible. In some images, the Tartar stood for cruelty. He was the invader, the destroyer, the one who burned cities. In others, he stood for simplicity. He was the nomad, close to the earth, unburdened by civilization. Both portraits were true in their way because both came from the same source. The artists did not know what to make of the Tartars. They drew their confusion. The artists who made these portraits were not liars. They were working with what they had. They drew from travelers, from memory, from imagination. They mixed what they saw with what they feared and what they hoped. The result was a gallery of half-truths, beautiful and misleading. Each portrait tells us more about the artist than about the subject. Each one is a mirror, reflecting the European mind. A late 18th century painting shows a Tartar family outside their tent. The father holds a bow. The mother stirs a pot. A child peeks from the door flap. The scene is peaceful, almost idyllic. The artist gave them clean clothes and gentle faces. He wanted to show their simple life, their closeness to nature. He did not show the cold, the hunger, the constant moving. He did not show the wars or the raids or the fear. He showed what he wanted to see. Another image from the same period shows a Tartar warrior in full armor. He is fierce, his eyes narrowed, his sword drawn. The artist gave him muscles and menace. He wanted to show the threat, the danger, the enemy at the gates. He did not show the man beneath the armor, the father or the son or the tired traveler. He showed what he feared. The prints spread across Europe, from Italy to England to the far reaches of Russia. They appeared in different languages, different styles, different scales. Some were crude, barely more than sketches. Others were elaborate, full of color and detail. But they all shared a common thread. They all tried to make the Tartars known, and they all failed in their own way. Now the portraits sit in digital archives, scanned and shared, viewed by anyone with a screen. They have outlived their creators and their subjects. They have become artifacts of a different time, when the world was still full of blank spaces on the map. They remind us that every image is a story, and every story is a choice. The artists chose what to draw, and their choices echo still. The last prints from the 19th century show a quiet shift. The Tartars are no longer exotic. They are ordinary, almost boring. A man sits on a bench smoking a pipe. A woman carries water from a well. The mystery has faded, replaced by the everyday. The artists have run out of wonder, or perhaps they have run out of fear. The Tartars have become neighbors, and neighbors are not interesting. But the older images remain, and they continue to haunt. They whisper of a time when the world was larger, when the edges were dark and full of possibility. They whisper of a people who were never quite known, never quite understood. They whisper of a name that once covered half the earth and now covers only memory. The portraits are quiet now, but they still speak. They speak of the meeting between worlds, the moment when one people tried to see another. They speak of the limits of that vision, the distortions and the omissions. They speak of the human need to make the strange familiar and the cost of that need. And then the images fade, and the people they depicted fade with them. The Tartars become trace, a shadow on the edge of the frame. The artists become names in catalogs, footnotes in histories. The portraits themselves become relics, admired for their age rather than their truth. Surviving remnants. The portraits of the past fade, and yet the name persists. It does not live only in old books or faded prints. It lives in the voices of people who still speak it, who carry it in their family names, their villages, their daily bread. The Tartars did not vanish. They changed, adapted, and endured. And in doing so, they kept a fragment of that vast and shadowed map alive. Consider the Tatars of Russia. They are not a single people, but a family of peoples. The Volga Tatars, the Crimean Tatars, the Siberian Tatars, each with their own tongue, their own customs, their own memory of a time when their ancestors rode across the steppe under banners that struck fear into the hearts of distant kings. Today, they number in the millions. They live in cities like Kazan, where the minarets rise above the Volga River, and in small villages where the old ways still hold. They speak a language that belongs to the Turkic family, a language with deep roots and many branches, and they call themselves Tatars, a name that once meant something terrible and foreign to the ears of medieval Europe. The name itself is a strange gift. It came from the Mongol conquests, when the armies of Genghis Khan swept westward. The chroniclers of the time wrote of the Tatar hordes, a word that mixed fear and ignorance. Some say the name came from the Tatars, a Turkic people who lived north of the Mongolian plateau. Others say it came from the Chinese word for their northern neighbors. And still others claim it was a misunderstanding, a confusion between the Mongols and the Tars that the Europeans never bothered to untangle. Whatever the origin, the name stuck. It spread across the map, attaching itself to a vast and undefined region. And when the empires shifted and the borders moved, the name remained, worn by the people who had once been its target. The Tatars of the Volga region offer a clear example. Their history stretches back centuries. They are the descendants of the Golden Horde, the Mongol state that ruled over much of what is now Russia. When the horde weakened and fractured, the Tatars built their own Khanates. The Khanate of Kazan was one of the most powerful. It controlled the crossroads of trade and culture, where the forests of the north met the steppes of the south. Its people were merchants, farmers, warriors, and scholars. They built mosques and madrasas, wrote poetry and chronicles, and maintained a civilization that rivaled its neighbors. But the Russians came. In 1552, Ivan the Terrible besieged Kazan and conquered it. The Khanate fell, and the Tars became subjects of the Tsar. They did not disappear. Some converted to Orthodoxy. Others kept their faith and their language in secret. They faced persecution and pressure, but they held on. Today, the Volga Tatars are one of the largest ethnic groups in Russia. They have their own republic, Tatarstan, with Kazan as its capital. They have their own schools, their own newspapers, their own theaters, and they still speak their language, a language that echoes of the steppe. The Crimean Tatars tell a different story, but with the same thread of endurance. Their homeland is the peninsula that juts into the Black Sea, a land of mountains and vineyards and ancient ports. They were the heirs of the Crimean Khanate, a state that lasted for centuries under the protection of the Ottoman Empire. They were raiders, sailors, and traders. Their horses were swift, their ships were quick, and their reach extended far beyond their shores. They were also a cultured people with a rich tradition of music and poetry and architecture. Then came the Russian Empire. In 1783, Catherine the Great annexed Crimea. The Tatars resisted, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. Many fled to the Ottoman Empire. Those who stayed faced a slow erosion of their rights and their land. The worst came during the Second World War, when Stalin accused the Crimean Tatars of collaboration with the Nazis. He deported them en masse to Central Asia in cattle cars with little warning and no mercy. Thousands died on the journey. The survivors were scattered across Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, forbidden from returning to their homeland. But they did return. After the fall of the Soviet Union, the Crimean Tatars began to move back, in small numbers at first, then in larger waves. They rebuilt their communities, their mosques, their schools. The process was difficult and slow. They faced hostility from the new authorities and competition for land and resources, but they persisted. Today, the Crimean Tatars are again a visible presence in their ancestral land. They hold seats in the local government, they publish in their own language, they teach their children the old songs, and they still call themselves Tatars, a name that carries the weight of their history. The Siberian Tatars are less known, but they are no less real. They live in the vast expanse of western Siberia along the rivers and in the forests. Their ancestors were the peoples who inhabited these lands before the Russian expansion. They were hunters, fishers, and reindeer herders. They had their own principalities, their own trade routes, their own relationships with the neighboring peoples. When the Russians arrived, they were absorbed into the empire, often through a mix of force and negotiation. They kept their language and their customs, though they borrowed much from their new rulers. Today, the Siberian Tatars are a small but distinct community. They live in villages and towns scattered across the region. They speak a dialect of Tatar that is closer to the old forms, less influenced by the changes that reshaped the Volga dialects. They preserve their traditions, their clothes, their foods, and they remember their past, a past that stretches back long before the Russians came. Beyond Russia, the name Tatars appears in Central Asia. The Kazakhs, the Uzbeks, the Kyrgyz, these peoples are not Tatars, but their history is intertwined with the Tatar world. They share the Turkic language family, the nomadic heritage, the legacy of the Mongol Empire. In the cities of Bukhara and Samarkand, Tatar merchants and scholars were common figures. They traded, taught, and built connections across the region. The Tatar language served as a lingua franca for many communities, a bridge between the different peoples of the steppe. And when the Russian Empire expanded into Central Asia, it brought Tatar administrators and teachers with it. They helped to govern, to educate, and to integrate. The Tatars of Poland and Lithuania also deserve mention. They arrived as captives and mercenaries, brought by the Grand Dukes to serve in their armies. They settled in the forests and plains of the Grand Duchy, where they formed small communities. They kept their faith, their customs, and their language, though they gradually adopted the local ways. They served as soldiers, farmers, and craftsmen. They built wooden mosques, some of which still stand today. And they called themselves Lipka Tatars, a name that distinguished them from their kin to the east. They were a small people, but they were a resilient one. They survived wars, partitions, and revolutions. Today, they number only a few thousand, but they maintain their identity and their heritage. The name Tatar, then, is not a relic. It is a living label worn by millions of people across a vast and varied landscape. It holds together a family of cultures that share a common origin and a common history. It is a reminder of the connections between the steppe and the settled world, between the nomad and the farmer, between the conqueror and the conquered. And it is a testament to the power of endurance, to the ability of a people to survive the fall of empires and the redrawing of borders. The language of the Tatars is a treasure in itself. It is a Turkic language with roots that reach back to the Orkhon inscriptions of the 8th century. It has borrowed from Arabic and Persian, from Russian and the European languages. It has absorbed the vocabulary of trade, of religion, of science. It has evolved and adapted, but it has never lost its core. It is a language of poetry and song, of proverbs and prayers. It is a language that carries the memory of the steppe, the rhythm of the horse, the wind across the grass. In Kazan, the Tatar language is taught in schools and universities. There are Tatar newspapers, Tatar radio stations, Tatar television channels. There are Tatar writers who publish novels and poems, Tatar musicians who compose new works in the old style. The language is not frozen in the past. It is alive, growing, changing. It is a living thing, and it carries the name of the people who speak it. The Tatars also carry their faith. Most are Sunni Muslims, following the traditions of the Hanafi school. Their mosques are centers of community life, places of prayer and learning and gathering. The imams teach the old texts, but they also address the new questions, the challenges of the modern world. The faith binds the Tatars together across the distances that separate them. It is a source of identity and a source of strength. The Tatar cuisine is another marker of identity. It is a cuisine of the steppe and the forest, of the river and the field. It is a cuisine of meat and dough, of dairy and honey. The eshpokmak, a triangular pastry filled with meat and potatoes, is a Tatar specialty. The chak-chak, a sweet made of fried dough and honey, is a Tatar delicacy. The kazilik, a dried sausage of horse meat, is a Tatar tradition. These foods are not just sustenance. They are memory. They are a way of passing on the past, of sharing the culture with the next generation. The Tatar dress is also distinctive. The traditional clothing, with its embroidered patterns and bright colors, is worn on special occasions. The tubeteka, the skull cap, is a symbol of Tatar identity. The kalfak, the woman's headdress, is a work of art in itself. These garments are not merely decorative. They are a statement of belonging, a visible sign of the wearer's connection to a long and rich tradition. It is spoken in the villages of the Volga and the cities of Crimea. It is written in the books of Kazan and the archives of Istanbul. It is sung in the songs of the steppe and the prayers of the mosques. It is a name that has survived the rise and fall of empires, the shifting of borders, the violence of conquest, and the cruelty of deportation. It is a name that has been twisted and distorted, used as a slur and a label, but it has never been erased. It is carried by the people who bear it, and it will continue to be carried as long as they are there to speak it. So when you hear the name Tatar, do not think only of the past. Think of the present, of the people who carry it forward. Think of the children learning their grandmother's songs, of the imams teaching the old texts, of the cooks preparing the traditional dishes. Think of the resilience that has kept this name alive through centuries of change. And know that the story of Tartary is not over. It is being told every day in the lives of the people who bear its name. The great games echo. The Tatars who carried that ancient name into the modern age were not the only ones shaped by the vast territories their ancestors once ruled. The land itself, that immense stretch between Europe and the Pacific, had become a prize. And by the middle of the 19th century, two empires had set their eyes upon it with an intensity that would reshape the region forever. Russia had been moving eastward for centuries, a slow and steady push that began long before the name Tartary faded from maps. The fur traders went first, then the soldiers, then the settlers. Each generation pushed the frontier a little further. By the 1800s, the Russian Empire had absorbed enormous portions of what cartographers once labeled as Tartary. The rivers that had carried Mongol horsemen now carried Russian grain. The steppes that had echoed with the thunder of hooves now heard the creak of wagons and the shouts of farmers. But Russia's advance did not stop at the borders of Siberia. The empire pressed south into the khanates that had once been part of the great Mongol inheritance. Khiva, Bukhara, Kokand. These names appear on old maps as parts of independent Tartary, realms that had maintained their own rulers and their own ways of life, even as the world around them changed. But their independence was fragile. The Russian army, with its modern rifles and disciplined formations, moved against these ancient states with methodical precision. One by one, they fell under Russian influence or direct control. The British watched this expansion with growing alarm. They had their own empire, the largest the world had ever seen, and they understood what Russian advances meant. If Russia gained control of Central Asia, the road to India lay open. The British called India the jewel in their imperial crown, the source of immense wealth and prestige. The thought of Russian armies marching toward its northern borders was a nightmare that kept colonial officials awake at night. So began what historians would later call the Great Game. It was not a war in the traditional sense. There were no great battles between British and Russian forces, no declarations of hostilities. Instead, it was a quiet and sometimes secretive struggle. Spies moved through the bazaars of Central Asian cities, gathering information about Russian troop movements and local loyalties. British officers, often disguised as merchants or pilgrims, mapped mountain passes and river crossings. Russian agents returned the favor, exploring the passes of the Hindu Kush and the deserts of Persia, looking for routes that might lead toward the Indian frontier. The territories that had once been marked on maps as Tartary became the board on which this game was played. Every village and valley gained strategic importance. Every local ruler became a potential ally or enemy. The British sent gifts and promises to the emirs and khans of the region, trying to build alliances that might block Russian expansion. The Russians offered their own gifts and promises, often more substantial because they were closer at hand. One of the most famous episodes of the Great Game involved a young British officer named Charles Stoddart. He was sent to Bukhara in 1838, carrying a letter from Queen Victoria to the emir. His mission was to secure an alliance and gather intelligence. But the emir was suspicious of this foreign visitor, and Stoddart found himself thrown into a dungeon. He spent months in captivity, and another British officer, Arthur Connolly, was sent to rescue him. Connolly failed in his mission, and both men were executed in 1842. Their deaths sent a chill through the British establishment, a reminder that the Great Game was played with real lives and real consequences. The Russians had their own heroes and martyrs in this silent conflict. Officers like Nikolai Przhevalsky, who explored the wilds of Central Asia and Tibet, mapping regions that no European had ever seen. His expeditions were scientific in name, but their true purpose was strategic. Every mountain he crossed, every river he charted, added to the Russian knowledge of the land that lay between their empire and the British domains. Przhevalsky's journeys were dangerous, and he faced hostile tribes, extreme weather, and the constant threat of disease. But he pushed on, driven by duty and ambition, and his maps would prove invaluable in the decades that followed. The local peoples of the former Tartary were caught in the middle of this imperial rivalry. The Uzbeks, Turkmens, Kazakhs, and others who had lived in the region for centuries found themselves courted by both sides, their loyalties tested and often divided. Some preferred the Russians, who were closer and more immediate in their presence. Others looked toward the British, hoping that their distant power might offer some check on Russian ambitions. But in truth, the locals had little agency in the matter. They were pawns in a game played by distant powers, and their own desires rarely mattered to the men who moved the pieces. The climax of the Great Game came in the 1880s and 1890s, when the two empires came closest to open conflict. Russian forces pushed toward the borders of Afghanistan, which the British considered their sphere of influence. In 1885, a clash at Panjshir between Russian and Afghan forces nearly sparked a full-scale war. The British public was outraged, and for several tense weeks, it seemed that the two empires might actually go to battle over the dusty plains of Central Asia. But neither side truly wanted war. The cost would have been enormous and the gains uncertain. Diplomats on both sides worked to defuse the crisis, and in 1895, the two empires signed an agreement that established the northern border of Afghanistan as the limit of Russian expansion. The Great Game, at least in its most intense phase, had come to an end. The territories that had once been called Tartary were now firmly divided between the Russian Empire and the various states of Central Asia, with Afghanistan serving as a buffer between the two imperial powers. What had been called Tartary was now broken into pieces. Russian Turkestan, Chinese Turkestan, the Khanate of Khiva, the Emirate of Bukhara. Each of these regions had its own history and its own peoples, and the old names faded further into memory. The Great Game had completed the work that cartographers had begun, replacing the ancient geography of Tartary with a new map of imperial possessions and spheres of influence. The name Tartary had already been disappearing from maps when the Great Game began. By the time it ended, the name was gone entirely, replaced by the administrative divisions of the Russian Empire and the subtle networks of British influence. But the spirit of the place, the vastness and mystery that had captured the imagination of medieval Europe, lived on in the reports of explorers and the dispatches of spies. The Great Game had revealed the secrets of Tartary to the world, but in doing so, it had also erased the last traces of its old identity. The land remained, but the name had become a memory, a ghost haunting the edges of modern geography. Tartary in memory. The Great Game had run its course, and the maps had been redrawn, but the name that faded from official documents did not fade from the human mind. It lingered the way a melody lingers after the music stops, unclear, half-remembered, but present, and in the centuries that followed, that memory took on a life of its own. The Romantic Turn. By the late 19th century, Tartary had become something it never was during its time on the maps. It became a dream. Europeans who had never set foot in Central Asia wrote poems about its vast steppes. Painters imagined grand cities with golden domes rising from the plains. Novelists placed their heroes in Tartar camps, among horsemen who spoke in riddles and moved like shadows. The real Tartars, the Turkic peoples, the Mongols, the various tribes who actually lived in those regions were often left out of these imaginings. The Romantic Tartary was not a place where real people lived. It was a stage, a setting for adventure, a backdrop for stories about the mysterious East, where anything seemed possible because so little was actually known. This was not new, of course. Marco Polo had started it centuries before, filling his accounts with wonders that may or may not have been true. Shakespeare had continued it, placing Tartars in his plays as figures of both threat and fascination. But the 19th century added something new, a sense of loss. The Romantic Tartary was not just mysterious, it was vanishing. Writers spoke of it in the past tense, as if the place had already died, even while real Tatars continued to live in Kazan, in Crimea, in the Siberian towns. The effect was strange. A name that had once been a practical label on a map became a symbol. It stood for the untamed, the unknown, the parts of the world that had not yet been fully cataloged and controlled. And as the actual territories were renamed and reorganized, the symbolic Tartary grew stronger. It was easier to romanticize a place that no longer appeared on any official document. The internet finds a ghost. The computer changed everything, not right away, but slowly over decades. By the early 2000s, people began to notice something odd. Old maps showed a land called Tartary. New maps did not. The question came naturally, where did it go? For most historians, the answer was simple. The name changed. That was all. Empires renamed their territories as they expanded. Russia called the region Siberia. China called it Xinjiang. The British and the French used their own terms for the parts they touched. Names on maps are not permanent. They shift with politics, with language, with the slow drift of power. But not everyone found this explanation satisfying. The internet gave voice to people who looked at those old maps and saw something else. They saw a land that was large, very large, larger than most countries today, and they wondered, how could such a vast place simply be renamed? How could a territory that covered so much of Asia just disappear from the record? The question spread through forums and social media, videos were made, threads were written, and a new version of Tartary began to emerge, not as a label on a map, but as a mystery, a puzzle, a secret that someone somewhere was hiding. The myth takes shape. The internet, Tartary was not the Tartary of the old maps. It was grander, more advanced. In these stories, Tartary was not a vague region of steppes and nomads. It was a civilization, a great power with cities that rivaled Paris and London, with technology that predated the Industrial Revolution, with a culture that had been deliberately destroyed, its buildings buried, its records burned, its very name erased from history. The evidence, they said, was all around. Those old maps showed Tartary as a single, vast entity. The star forts scattered across Europe and Asia were its remains. The old buildings with their strange architecture were its legacy. The mud that covered so many ancient structures was the proof of its destruction. A great flood, they claimed, had buried the Tartar world, and the survivors had built a new history on top of the ruins. Historians shook their heads. The maps, they pointed out, were not precise. The name Tartary covered a wide area because the cartographers did not know what was actually there. It was a label for the unknown, not a description of a real state. The star forts were built by European engineers in the 16th and 17th centuries for reasons of military defense. The old buildings were simply old. They had not been buried by a flood, but had been renovated, rebuilt, and sometimes demolished as cities grew and changed. But the explanations did not satisfy everyone. The internet version of Tartary had a power that the historical version lacked. It was a story with villains and victims, with a great civilization brought low, with secrets hidden by the powerful. And stories are harder to counter than arguments. The shape of belief. What did believers actually think Tartary was? The answers varied. Some saw it as a global empire, stretching not just across Asia, but across the entire world. They pointed to similarities in architecture, in symbols, in the layout of old cities. Others saw it as a Russian civilization, a precursor to the modern state, its history stolen by the Romanovs. Still others saw it as a lost continent, a kind of Atlantis on land, destroyed by a flood that had been written out of the records. The common thread was the belief in erasure. Tartary was not simply renamed, it was erased. Its history was scrubbed, its people were scattered, its monuments were buried or repurposed. The evidence was not in archives, they said, but in the physical world, in the buildings that did not match the official histories, in the maps that showed a different reality, in the gaps and inconsistencies that careful study would reveal. Historians responded with a simple mantra: absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. But the mantra did not work. The believers were not looking for evidence in the usual way. They were looking for confirmation of what they already suspected, that the world was not as it seemed, that a great secret lay buried beneath the surface of official history. As of now, the Tartary myth continues to circulate. It has become part of the larger ecosystem of alternative history, alongside claims about lost civilizations, ancient technologies, and hidden empires. It has its own vocabulary, its own symbols, its own set of preferred images. The old maps are shared endlessly. The star forts are photographed and analyzed. The buildings that some believe to be Tartar are pointed out in city after city. There is no sign that the myth will fade. It has become a fixture of the internet, a story that people tell and retell, adding new details, refining the narrative. It has also become a source of identity for some, a way of seeing oneself as someone who knows, someone who has seen through the lies, someone who understands the true shape of history. And yet, there is something wistful about it all. The internet Tartary is a ghost, a memory of a memory. It is not the real Tartary of the medieval maps, which was never a nation and never a civilization. It is a dream built on a name, a fantasy that grew in the spaces left by ignorance and curiosity. The real Tartars, the Tatars of Kazan and Crimea, the Turkic peoples of Central Asia, the Mongols of the steppe, continue to live, to speak their languages, to maintain their cultures. They do not need the myth. They have their own histories, their own memories, their own names. The myth of Tartary is a European creation, an internet invention, a story told by outsiders about a place they never knew.